Let's travel back in time a little. Now I'm going to tell you a story. Quietly, calmly. Just listen. Imagine the North. Harsh, cold, shrouded in mist and legends. Somewhere on the edge of the known world, among fjords and forests, among mountains and boundless seas, lived a people. Ordinary people. They plowed the land, fished, raised children. But there was something special about them, something that made the whole world remember them for centuries. We call them Vikings. But you know, that word didn't appear right away. And not even all of those whom we now call Vikings considered themselves to be Vikings. The word Viking itself, it's like a profession, you see. It comes from the Old Norse word vikingur, which roughly meant a person from the bay, or one who goes on a sea voyage. People became Vikings. It was a choice, to go to sea, to head for the horizon, to risk everything for wealth, fame, or simply for adventure. In those times, in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, when Europe was just beginning to recover after the fall of the Roman Empire, life in the north, in Scandinavia, flowed at its own pace. There were 3 great lands there, 3 homelands of the future Vikings. The first was Norway, a land of fjords, where the sea cuts into the land in long, narrow bays, like giant fingers. The mountains there rise straight from the water, and between them lie small valleys where one could start a farm and raise children. Life in Norway was tough. There was little land, and even less of it was arable. But there was plenty of sea, and the Norwegians learned from childhood how to handle boats, how to read the winds and currents. The second was Denmark. It was located a little to the south, on the Jutland Peninsula and the surrounding islands. It was easier there, warmer. The land was more fertile, and trade routes passed nearby. The Danes were closer to the rest of Europe, and they felt it. They were the first to have real cities, the first trading centers. And the third was Sweden, the eastern land stretching along the Baltic Sea. Endless forests, thousands of lakes, rivers leading to the east, to the lands inhabited by Slavs, Finns, and Balts. The Swedes looked not to the west, but to the east. Their path lay across the Baltic, down the rivers, to the riches of Byzantium and the Arab East. But you know what's interesting? The inhabitants of these lands didn't call themselves Vikings. They were Norwegians, Danes, Swedes. They were farmers, fishermen, artisans, and those who went to sea became Vikings. A Viking, that was an occupation, you see? Like we now say sailor or merchant. One could be a Viking in the summer, and in the winter return home and become an ordinary peasant again. The first written mentions of them appeared at the end of the 8th century, and it must be said they appeared quite dramatically. Imagine a quiet monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of England. June 7th, 793. The monks are praying, copying books, living their measured lives, and suddenly, sails on the horizon. Long, narrow ships with dragon heads on their prows crash right onto the shore. Bearded warriors with axes and swords jump out of them. What happened next horrified all of Christian Europe. The monastery was plundered, the monks were killed or taken into slavery, and the sacred relics were desecrated. And the most terrifying part, no one understood who they were. Where did they come from? Why did they attack a holy place? What did they want? The monk Alcuin, one of the most learned men of his time, later wrote, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." He called them pagans because the Vikings were not yet Christians. They worshipped their own gods, Odin, Thor, Freya. After Lindisfarne, other raids began. At first they were rare, then more and more frequent. Vikings attacked the coasts of England, Ireland, and Scotland. They sailed up rivers and plundered cities that were considered inaccessible from the sea. Europeans prayed, "From the fury of the Northmen deliver us, O Lord." Northmen, that's what they were also called, men from the north. But you see, the Vikings were not just robbers. Yes, they plundered, but they also traded, explored new lands, and founded settlements. They were seafarers, the likes of which the world had never seen. Their ships, the drakars, were a marvel of engineering. Light, fast, they could travel under sail or with oars. They could sail across the open ocean, and they could enter a shallow river. On such ships, the Vikings reached Iceland, Greenland, even North America, 500 years before Columbus. In the chronicles of that time, in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, in the Frankish annals, the name of the Vikings appeared more and more often. In the year 795, the pagans ravaged the monastery at Jarrow, wrote the English. In the year 845, the Northmen reached Paris, recorded the Franks. In the year 860, the Varangians came to Novgorod, noted the Russian chroniclers. Varangians, that's what the Scandinavians were called in Rus. The word possibly comes from the Old Norse varingur, ally, or member of a retinue. In the East, the Vikings were known by other names. In Byzantium, they were called Varangians, and in Arab sources, Rus or Magus, fire worshippers. Each nation gave them its own name, but they all spoke of the same thing, of tall, fair-haired warriors sailing from the north on swift ships, of men who feared neither storm, nor distance, nor death. But who were they really, these Vikings? Why did they suddenly appear then, at the end of the 8th century? What made peaceful Scandinavian farmers suddenly take up arms and set off to plunder and trade throughout the known world? The fact is that by the end of the 8th century, a special situation had developed in Scandinavia. The population was growing, but the amount of land remained the same. This was felt especially acutely in Norway, where there was always a shortage of arable land. Families were large. A Norwegian might have 5, 7, 10 children, and they all needed land, a farm, a means of subsistence. But according to tradition, the eldest son received the entire inheritance. He became the master of the farm, continuing his father's work. And the younger ones? The younger ones were left to either hire themselves out as laborers to their brother or seek their fortune elsewhere. And many chose the latter. They formed retinues, built or bought ships, and went to sea. Some went to trade. Furs, amber, iron, everything that could be sold in the south was expensive. Some went to plunder. Monasteries held countless riches, gold, silver, and they were poorly protected. Some sought new lands for settlement. Maybe somewhere across the sea there was an island where they could start a new life. And then there was fame. For a Viking, fame meant a great deal. More than life, more than wealth. A Viking believed that after death he would go to Valhalla, Odin's heavenly hall, only if he died with a weapon in his hand, having performed glorious deeds. And to die in one's bed of old age, that was a disgrace. Such a person awaited not Valhalla, but gloomy Helheim, the realm of the dead. Therefore, the Vikings did not fear death. They sought it, sought battle, sought danger. They believed it was better to live a short but vibrant life than a long but boring one. Cattle die, kinsmen die, and you yourself will die, said one ancient song. But I know one thing that lives forever, the fame of a dead man's deeds. By the end of the 8th century, another important condition had developed in Scandinavia. They had finally learned how to build true ocean-going ships. Before that, Scandinavians had sailed in simple boats, suitable only for coastal navigation. But then the drakar appeared, a long, narrow ship with a high-raised bow and stern, with one large square sail and rows of oars along the sides. The drakkar was a revolution. On it, one could cross the North Sea, reach England, France, the Mediterranean. On it, one could sail up rivers, reaching the very heart of Europe. And at the same time, the drakkar was light enough that it could be pulled ashore or even portaged overland from one river to another. Everything came together: overpopulation, inheritance traditions, a thirst for fame and wealth, and new ships. And at the end of the 8th century, the Scandinavians poured into the world. The Viking Age began, 3 centuries that changed the face of Europe. They came from the north every summer, like a seasonal storm. In the spring, when the ice melted and the sea opened up, the Vikings would launch their drakkars, load their weapons and supplies, and set off. Some went west, to the shores of England and Ireland. Some went south, to France and Spain, and some went east, across the Baltic to the Slavic lands. Monks recorded their raids with horror. The Swedes came from across the sea, the Varangians sailed in, the Northmen arrived. Each entry is someone's tragedy: a plundered city, a burned church, people taken into slavery. But each entry is also a new page of history, a new step in the exploration of the world. Because the Vikings were not just robbers, they were pioneers, explorers, merchants, settlers. They discovered new lands, founded cities, mingled with local peoples. They left their mark everywhere, from Greenland to Baghdad, from Iceland to Constantinople. And it all began somewhere at the end of the 8th century, when the first drakkars cast off from the Scandinavian shores and set a course for the south. When the first Vikings decided that life on a small Norwegian farm was not for them. When they chose the sea, adventure, the unknown. That is how the story of the Vikings began. The story of a people who were not afraid to challenge the sea, fate, and the entire world. A story that would last for 300 years and forever change Europe. You know, to truly understand the Vikings, you need to understand what they believed in. Because their faith, it wasn't just a religion in our sense of the word. It was an entire world, a whole universe that explained everything: where the world came from, where it was going, how one should live, and how one should die. Imagine a dark winter evening in a longhouse somewhere in Norway. A blizzard is howling outside, but inside it is warm. The hearth is burning, the firewood is crackling. The whole family is gathered around the fire. The children are huddled close to their parents. The old folks are sitting closer to the warmth. And someone begins to tell stories. Stories about gods, about heroes, about how the world is structured. These stories were passed down from generation to generation, from father to son, from mother to daughter. They were not written down. The Vikings did not have writing for a long time. They were sung, told, memorized. And every Viking knew these stories by heart from childhood. Knew about the gods as well as he knew his own family. Let's start from the very beginning, from how the Vikings imagined the structure of the world. They believed that the world consisted of 9 worlds connected by a gigantic ash tree, the World Tree, which was called Yggdrasil. Imagine a tree so enormous that its roots go into the very depths of the universe and its crown touches the heavens. On its branches and under its roots are all 9 worlds. At the top, in the crown of the tree, was Asgard, the world of the gods, a heavenly fortress surrounded by high walls. There, in golden halls, lived the Aesir, the main gods of the Vikings. There was Valhalla, the heavenly hall of fallen warriors. There, the fate of all 9 worlds was decided. In the middle, on one of the large branches, was Midgard, the middle realm, the world of humans, our world. The Vikings believed that Midgard was surrounded by a boundless ocean in which lived the monstrous serpent Jörmungandr, so large that it encircled the entire earth and held its tail in its mouth. Beneath the roots of the tree were dark and dangerous worlds. There was Helheim, the realm of the dead, where the goddess Hel ruled. There was Niflheim, the world of ice and mist. There was Muspelheim, the world of fire, where the fire giants lived. There were other worlds, too, Vanaheim, where the Vanir, another tribe of gods, lived. Alfheim, the world of the light elves. Svartalfheim, the world of the dark elves, the underground smiths. Jotunheim, the world of the Jotnar, the giants, the eternal enemies of the gods. And so, on this cosmic tree, in golden Asgard, lived the gods. And the first of them, the chief, the most powerful, was Odin. Odin, the All-Father, as he was called. Odin, the Wanderer. Odin, the Warrior. Odin, the Wise. He was the god of war, but not only war. He was the god of wisdom, poetry, magic, death. The Vikings imagined him as an old man with a long gray beard, in a wide-brimmed hat and a cloak. He had only one eye, the other he sacrificed to drink from the well of wisdom. Odin sat on a throne high in Asgard, and from there he could see all 9 worlds. On his shoulders sat 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. Every morning they flew around all the worlds and brought Odin news of what was happening everywhere. At his feet lay 2 wolves, Geri and Freki, and Odin rode an 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, the fastest steed in all the worlds. But Odin was a complex, unpredictable god. He could help a warrior in battle, or he could betray him at the most crucial moment. Because Odin needed not just victories, he needed fallen heroes for his army. He was preparing for the final battle, for Ragnarok, and was gathering an army of slain warriors in Valhalla. The Vikings worshipped Odin, but they also feared him. He was the god of jarls and konungs, of warriors and skalds. He demanded sacrifices, and not simple ones. Sacrifices to Odin were hanged from trees, pierced with spears. Odin himself, according to the myths, hung for 9 days and 9 nights on the world tree, pierced by a spear, to learn the secrets of the runes, magical signs that grant power over the world. But there was another god in Asgard, a much simpler and more understandable one. A god who was loved by common people, peasants, and seafarers. This was Thor, son of Odin, the god of thunder and lightning. Thor was the complete opposite of his father. Where Odin was cunning and unpredictable, Thor was straightforward and honest. Where Odin was old and wise, Thor was young and strong. The Vikings imagined him as a huge, red-bearded giant with a good-natured but formidable face. Thor protected Asgard and Midgard from giants and monsters. He had a magical hammer, Mjolnir, which always returned to its owner's hand and could shatter a mountain with a single blow. When Thor rode his chariot, drawn by 2 goats, across the sky, the rumble of the wheels created thunder, and the sparks from the hooves created lightning. Thor was loved for his simplicity and reliability. He didn't make cunning plans, didn't weave intrigues. If he saw an enemy, he struck with his hammer. If someone offended humans or gods, Thor came to the rescue. Peasants wore small hammers of Thor around their necks as protective amulets. Seafarers prayed to him to calm the storm. His name was the most popular: Thorstein, Thorvald, Thorgir. In the Scandinavian pantheon, there was also a god of cunning, a god of deception, a god of unpredictability. His name was Loki, and he was not quite a god, more of a giant accepted into Asgard. Loki was handsome, charming, witty. He could take any form, turn into a bird, a beast, a woman. He was a friend to the gods, but also their curse. Loki constantly got into trouble and dragged the gods into it with him. He stole, deceived, played pranks. but often his own cunning helped the gods get out of trouble. He was like fire, useful, but dangerous. The Vikings had a dual attitude towards him. On the one hand, they admired his intelligence and ingenuity. On the other, they understood that he brought disaster. According to legend, it would be Loki who would ultimately cause Ragnarok, the end of the world. He would kill the beloved god Balder, son of Odin, and for this he would be punished, bound to a rock, with a serpent dripping venom onto his face. But when the end of time comes, Loki will break free and lead an army of giants and monsters against the gods. Among the gods, there was also Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and war. Yes, war too. Because in the world of the Vikings, women were not helpless creatures, but warriors capable of standing up for themselves. Freya was beautiful. She rode in a chariot drawn by cats, wore the necklace Brisingamen, for which she gave herself to 4 dwarf smiths. She had a cloak of falcon feathers, which allowed her to fly. Freya cried golden tears when she longed for her husband, who had gone on long journeys. But Freya was not just the goddess of love. She took half of the warriors fallen in battle to her hall, Folkvanger. The other half went to Odin in Valhalla. She knew the magic of Seder, a special kind of sorcery associated with prophecy and changing fate. There were other gods as well. Freyr, Freya's brother, the god of fertility and prosperity. Tyr, the god of war and justice, who lost his hand in the mouth of the monstrous wolf Fenrir. Heimdall, the guardian of Asgard, whose horn would announce the beginning of Ragnarok. Balder, beautiful and kind, whose death would be the beginning of the end. Frigg, Odin's wife, the mother goddess, who knows the fates of all but keeps silent about them. The Viking gods were not omnipotent, they were not immortal. They grew old, and only the apples of the goddess Idun kept them young. They could be wounded, even killed. They made mistakes, deceived each other, quarreled, made peace. They were like humans, only stronger, wiser, more powerful. And this is important to understand. For a Viking, the gods were not distant, abstract entities. They were almost like relatives, elder, powerful, but understandable. One could make a deal with them, bring them a sacrifice, ask for help. They understood human desires and fears because they experienced them themselves. But over the gods and humans, over all 9 worlds, hung the shadow of fate. The Vikings believed in fate, in predestination. They called it weird. 3 Norns, Urdur, Verdandi, and Skuld, sat at the roots of the world tree and spun the threads of fate for all beings, including the gods. Fate was inevitable. One could not escape what was predestined, but one could meet it with dignity. One could not be afraid, not give up, fight to the end. In this was honor, in this was fame, and the greatest, most inevitable fate was Ragnarok, the end of the world, the doom of the gods. The Vikings believed that the world was not eternal, that a day would come when everything would collapse, when the final battle would be fought, when the gods would fall and the worlds would burn. And this day was not just an end, it was predestined from the very beginning. Ragnarok will begin with portents. 3 winters in a row will pass without a summer, Fimbulvetur, the great winter. Snow will fall from all directions, winds will howl, the sun will cease to warm. People will forget about honor and kinship. Brother will turn against brother, father against son. The world will plunge into chaos. Then the monsters, bound by the gods, will be freed. The wolf Fenrir, born of Loki, will break his chains. The serpent Jormungandr will rise from the ocean and crawl onto the land, poisoning everything with its venom. The ship Naglfar, made from the fingernails of the dead, will set sail from Helheim, led by Loki. On it will sail the dead and the giants. From the south will come the fire giants from Muspelheim, led by their lord Surtur, carrying a flaming sword. From the east will appear the Jötnar, the giants, the enemies of the gods. They will march on Asgard. Heimdall, the guardian of the gods, will blow his horn Gjallarhorn. The sound of the horn will awaken all the gods, all the heroes in Valhalla. Odin will don his armor, take up his spear Gungnir. Thor will raise Mjolnir. All the Einherjar, the fallen warriors who feasted in Valhalla, will go out for the final battle. They will meet on the plain of Vigridr, and a battle will begin, the likes of which has never been seen. Odin will fight the wolf Fenrir, and the wolf will swallow the Allfather. But Odin's son, Vidar, will tear the wolf's jaws apart and avenge his father. Thor will kill the serpent Jormungandr with his hammer, but will himself fall, poisoned by its venom, after taking only 9 steps. Freyr will face Surtur and perish, because he gave away his sword for love. Tyr and the hellhound Garmr will kill each other. Loki and Heimdall will fight, and both will fall. The gods will die, the heroes will die. Surtur will swing his flaming sword, and the world will be engulfed in flame. The stars will fall from the sky, the world tree will tremble, the earth will sink into the sea. Everything will disappear in fire and water. But this is not the end, because after Ragnarok, the world will be reborn. The earth will rise from the sea, green and new. Some gods will survive, the sons of Odin and Thor. They will find the golden chess pieces of the gods in the grass and remember the past. Balder, beautiful and innocent, will return from Helheim. 2 surviving humans will be found, Lif and Lifthrasir, hidden in the world tree. They will give rise to a new humanity, and the world will begin anew. For a Viking, this story was not just a fairy tale. It was the truth about the world. The world is finite, the gods are not eternal, everything will sooner or later come to an end. But this does not make life meaningless. On the contrary, it makes every day valuable, every action important. If even the gods are doomed, if even they meet their fate with courage, then how should a person live? With honor, with dignity, not trying to escape fate, but meeting it face to face, not asking for mercy, but fighting to the last breath. This philosophy permeated everything, the way the Vikings fought, without fear of death, with the fury of berserkers, the way they traveled, not fearing storms and the unknown, the way they lived to the fullest, not putting things off for later. And of course, this faith required the worship of the gods. The Vikings built sanctuaries, made sacrifices, performed rituals. The sanctuaries were varied. Somewhere they were temples, hof, wooden buildings with images of the gods. Somewhere they were simply sacred groves, where it was forbidden to cut trees and spill blood. Somewhere they were individual trees, stones, springs, anything that seemed filled with divine power. The most important sanctuary was at Uppsala, in Sweden. There stood a huge temple adorned with gold. Inside were images of the 3 main gods, Odin, Thor, and Freyr. Every 9 years a great festival, a blot, was held there. Sacrifices were made, animals, and in ancient times, possibly even humans. The victims were hanged on trees in a sacred grove. According to the Christian missionary Adam of Bremen, the bodies of men, dogs, and horses hung there. Ordinary festivals were simpler. A family or community would gather, slaughter an animal, most often a horse, boar, or bull. The meat was boiled or roasted. The blood was sprinkled on the idols and the participants of the rite. Then the meat was eaten at a feast. They drank beer or mead, made toasts, skål, to the gods, to the ancestors, to the konung, for good luck on a raid. There were seasonal festivals, Yule, the winter solstice, when they prayed for the return of the sun and for fertility. This was the most important festival, celebrated for 12 days with feasting and gift-giving. Many Yule traditions later passed into Christian Christmas. There was a festival at the beginning of summer when they thanked the gods for surviving the winter, a harvest festival in the autumn. Each festival was accompanied by sacrifices, feasts, and sometimes competitions and games. Sacrifices were made not only on major holidays. Before an important undertaking, a raid, a battle, the start of construction, a Viking might make a sacrifice. Sometimes it was an animal, sometimes just food and drink left at a sacred place. Sometimes valuables were thrown into a lake or a bog. Archaeologists find such hoards all over Scandinavia. There were also human sacrifices, though it seems not as often as Christian chroniclers wrote. Slaves were usually sacrificed, sometimes captives. In special cases, volunteers who believed they would go straight to Valhalla. When an important konung or jarl died, he might be accompanied to the afterlife by slave girls, killed at his funeral. Funerals were an important ritual in general. The Vikings believed that the dead needed things in the afterlife. Therefore, they were buried with weapons, jewelry, and tools. The wealthy were buried in boats, entire ships buried in the ground or burned. The boat was supposed to deliver the deceased to the afterlife. The famous burial ships from Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway show what this looked like. A huge ship in the center, a burial chamber with the body around it. Everything necessary for life: kitchen utensils, sleds, carts, beds, food, animals, slaves. All this was buried under a huge mound. Common people were buried more simply, but also with their belongings, also with honors, because every Viking believed that life continued after death. Where exactly he would go depended on how he died and how he lived. Those who fell in battle went to Valhalla or to Freya. There they feasted, fought in training during the day, and in the evening their wounds healed, and they feasted again. They were preparing for Ragnarok, for the final battle on the side of the gods. Those who died of illness or old age went to Helheim, to the goddess Hel. This was not hell in the Christian sense, rather a gray, misty place where souls continued to exist, but without joy or glory. Those who drowned at sea went to the goddess Ran, the wife of the sea giant Aegir. She caught sailors in her net and took them to her home at the bottom of the sea. There were other options. The main thing was to die with dignity, with a weapon in hand, with the name of a god on one's lips, with the thought of glory. Magic played a large role in the life of the Vikings. They believed that the world was full of invisible forces that could be used if one knew how. Runes, magical signs, could heal, protect, curse. Rune masters carved them on weapons, on ships, on stones. There were special types of magic: Seder, sorcery associated with prophecy and changing fate. This was a female art, although Odin himself also possessed it. Volvas, prophetesses, wandered through villages predicting the future, healing, cursing. They were treated with respect and fear. There were Galdrar, magical songs and spells. There were protective amulets, Thor's hammers, images of Valkyries, runes. All this was meant to protect from evil, bring good luck, and help in battle. The Vikings lived in a world full of spirits and powers. The spirits of ancestors lived in burial mounds and had to be honored. Elves and dwarves lived in forests and mountains, and one had to know how to deal with them. Trolls and giants roamed in remote places. The Norns spun the threads of fate. Valkyries chose the fallen on the battlefield. Everything was alive. Everything was full of meaning. A tree was not just a tree. It could be a spirit, or a sacred place, or part of the world tree. Thunder was not just thunder. It was Thor riding his chariot. The northern lights were not just light. They were the reflections from the Valkyrie's armor, or a bridge between worlds. This belief made the Vikings fearless. Why fear death if you know you will go to Valhalla? Why fear a storm if Thor is with you? Why fear an enemy if your fate is already sealed by the Norns? And this same belief made them cruel. If the gods demanded sacrifices, sacrifices had to be made. If enemies did not believe in the right gods, their temples could be plundered. If a slave was just a thing in this life, what did it matter if he remained a thing in the next? The world of the Vikings was a harsh but understandable world. It had rules, it had gods, it had fate. In it, they knew that everything would end, but that did not make life meaningless. On the contrary, it made every moment valuable, every choice important. And when a Viking went to sea, he knew the gods were watching him. Odin was counting the fallen for his army. Thor was calming the waves. Freya was crying golden tears over their separation. The Norns were spinning his fate. And ahead, fame, wealth, adventure. And someday, at the end, Valhalla, where the heroes of the past awaited. And even further, Ragnarok, the final battle, where even the gods would fall, but they would fall with honor. This is what the Vikings believed. And this belief led them across the seas, through battles, through life. Now let's take a look at the daily life of the Vikings, because they were not only warriors and seafarers. Most of the time they were just people, plowing the land, raising children, building houses, trading, quarreling, and making peace. Their life was full of ordinary worries, joys, and sorrows. Imagine a typical Viking settlement somewhere in Norway or Denmark. It's not a city in our sense of the word, more like a few farms scattered some distance from each other. Each farm is a whole household where a large family lives with all their relatives, servants, and slaves. In the center of the farm stands a longhouse, a langhus. This is the main building, the heart of the entire household. The longhouse is indeed long, from 15 to 30 meters, and sometimes even longer, but it is narrow, about 5 to 7 meters wide. The walls are made of logs or of vertical posts with wattle and daub walls between them. The roof is gabled, covered with straw or turf. In Iceland, where wood is scarce, the walls were often made of turf. Such houses looked like earthen mounds. Inside the longhouse it is semi-dark. There are almost no windows, just small openings in the walls, covered with hides or simply left open. Light comes mainly from the hearth, which burns in the middle of the house. The hearth is not a stove with a chimney, but simply a pit or a flat stone platform where a fire is made. The smoke rises to the ceiling and exits through an opening in the roof. Therefore, it is always a bit smoky in the house, smelling of a campfire. Along the walls run long benches, bekir. People sit on them during the day and sleep on them at night, laying down animal hides and covering themselves with blankets. Wealthy masters might have separate sleeping quarters inside annexes, but common people all sleep together in the main hall. In the center, by the hearth, is the master's main seat, the high seat. This is the place of honor. The head of the family sits here, or a konung if he is a guest, or the most respected guest. On either side of him, people are seated according to seniority and importance. The closer you are to the high seat, the higher your status. During the day, the longhouse is bustling with activity. Women spin, weave, sew, and cook food. Men repair tools, weapons, and equipment. Children run around, play, and help the adults. Slaves perform the heaviest work, carrying water, chopping wood, cleaning the byre. In the evening, when it gets dark, everyone gathers around the hearth. This is the time for eating, for conversation, for stories. Soup or porridge is cooked in a large cauldron over the fire. Meat is roasted on spits. Bread, cheese, and dried fish are brought out. Ale or mead is poured into wooden cups and drinking horns. The Vikings eat twice a day, in the morning, after waking up and starting work, and in the evening, when it gets dark. The food is simple but filling. Bread made from barley, oats, sometimes rye, porridge, oatmeal, barley, meat, lamb, pork, beef, game, fish, dried, salted, smoked, milk, cottage cheese, butter, cheese, vegetables, cabbage, onions, peas, carrots, fruits and berries in the summer, honey for sweetness. They mostly drink ale, a weak beer made from barley. Everyone drinks it, even children, because the water is often unclean. On holidays and at feasts, mead, a fermented drink made from honey and water. Wine is a rarity, brought from the south, and it is expensive. After the meal, when everyone is full and content, the most interesting part begins. Someone takes out a musical instrument, a lyre, a flute, a horn. The music starts. Someone begins a song about the gods, about heroes, about distant voyages. A skald, if there is one in the house, begins to tell a saga, a long story about ancestors, about deeds, about love and revenge. The children listen, holding their breath. The adults sing along to familiar songs, laugh at jokes, nod when the talk turns to honor and duty. This is not just entertainment. It is the transmission of traditions. It is education. It is the memory of the clan. Around the longhouse are other buildings, a byre for the livestock, cows, sheep, goats, pigs. In Scandinavia, winters are long and cold, so the livestock must be kept indoors, and hay must be stored for them, barns for grain and supplies, a smithy, if there is a blacksmith in the family, a bathhouse, a small building where they steamed and washed themselves. The Vikings loved cleanliness, washing once a week, which was rare for those times. Beyond the farm are fields and meadows. The Vikings were primarily farmers. They plowed the land with a wooden plow with an iron tip, pulled by oxen. They sowed barley, oats, rye, sometimes wheat. They mowed grass for hay. They tended to orchards where apple, cherry, and nut trees grew. The work of a farmer was hard, especially in Norway, where land is scarce, rocky, and the climate is harsh. They had to reclaim every patch of arable land from the forest and stones. They had to work from dawn to dusk to grow enough food for the long winter. But there were other occupations as well. Fishing, a vital industry, especially in coastal areas. The Vikings caught herring, cod, salmon. They dried the fish in the wind, salted it, smoked it. Dried fish, skride, was a staple food that could be stored for years and taken on long voyages. Hunting provided meat and hides. They hunted deer, elk, boars, hares, and birds. In the northern regions, they hunted walruses and seals for their blubber, meat, and valuable tusks. Furs, beaver, marten, fox, were an important commodity for trade. Craftsmanship also played a large role. Every Viking knew how to do something with his hands. Men made wooden dishes, tools, and repaired weapons. Women spun wool, wove fabric, sewed clothes, and made shoes. But there were also professional craftsmen. Blacksmiths forged iron, weapons, tools, nails, staples. A good sword or axe was a work of art. The blacksmith would weld together strips of iron of different hardness, creating a patterned blade, strong and sharp. Such a sword could cost a fortune, was passed down as an inheritance, given a name, and songs were composed about it. Shipwrights built the drakars, the famous Viking ships. This was a high art. One had to choose the right wood, usually oak for the keel and ribs, pine for the planking. One had to know how to bend the planks, how to fasten them with iron rivets so that the hull was both strong and flexible. One had to understand the forms, know how to make a ship fast and seaworthy. Wood carvers decorated ships, houses, and utensils with complex patterns, intertwining ribbons, dragons, animals. This was a special style, Scandinavian, recognizable. It spoke of status, wealth, and the owner's taste. Jewelers worked with gold, silver, and bronze. They made jewelry, fibulae for fastening cloaks, bracelets, rings, necklaces. Jewelry was not just beautiful, it showed status and wealth. It was given as a reward for service, sacrificed to the gods, and placed in graves. Potters made pots. Although ceramics were not very developed in Scandinavia, they used wood and metal more. Glassblowers made beads, sometimes small vessels. Tanners processed leather for shoes, belts, and scabbards. All these craftsmen lived by their labor. Some worked in a separate workshop, some traveled from farm to farm, offering their services. In large settlements, in trading centers, entire quarters of craftsmen appeared, a street of blacksmiths, a street of shipwrights. Merchants were also an important part of society. Not all Vikings were robbers, many preferred trade. They traveled by rivers and seas, carrying goods from one end of the world to the other. They exchanged furs and amber from the north for silk and silver from the east, iron and weapons from the west, for slaves and honey from the south. The trade routes of the Vikings stretched all over Europe and beyond, to the west, to England, Ireland, France, Spain, to the east, across the Baltic, along the rivers of Russes to the Caspian and Black Seas, to Byzantium and the Arab East, to the north, to the Arctic for walrus tusks and hides, to the south, to the Mediterranean. Trading centers emerged. Hedeby in Denmark was one of the largest, thousands of inhabitants, craftsmen, merchants from all over the world. Birka in Sweden, on an island in Lake Mälaren, controlled trade in the east. Kaupang in Norway, Ladoga in Rus. In each such place, life was bustling, languages and cultures mixed, and not only goods, but also ideas were exchanged. And now let's talk about women. Because in Viking society, a woman occupied a special position, much freer and more respected than in many other cultures of that time. A girl was born into a family and received a name on the 9th day. This was an important ritual. The father acknowledged her as his child, sprinkled her with water. From childhood, she was taught everything a housewife needed to know. Spinning wool. This was the main skill. The spindle was a symbol of a woman. Weaving fabric on a vertical loom. Sewing clothes, embroidering, cooking, brewing beer, making cheese, caring for children, the sick, and the elderly. But they were taught other things, too. They were told sagas, taught to remember their genealogy, who descended from whom, who was related to whom, what debts of honor existed between clans. This was important because a woman was the keeper of the family's memory. A girl usually married at around 15 or 16 years of age. The marriage was arranged by the parents, but the girl's opinion was also taken into account. She could refuse if she did not like the groom. A bride price, munder, was paid, which was a substantial sum. But this money became the property of the woman herself, not her husband, not her father. It was her guarantee, her security. The groom also gave a dowry, heimanfylgja. This was property that the wife received in the event of a divorce or the husband's death. Yes, divorce. The Vikings could divorce, and a woman could initiate a divorce herself if her husband beat her, was unfaithful, or did not provide for her well. She would take her dowry, her munder, and leave. The children usually stayed with the father, but the mother maintained a connection with them. A married woman became the mistress of the house. This was a serious role, a great responsibility. The husband could be absent for months, even years, on a raid, a trading trip, at war. During all this time, the wife managed the household. She managed the servants and slaves, oversaw the work, decided what to sow, what to sell, what to buy. She had the keys to all the storerooms and chests, a bunch of keys on her belt, a symbol of a married woman, the mistress of the house. These keys gave her authority over all the family's property. She could manage it while her husband was away. A woman could own property. She could inherit, although after her brothers. She could engage in trade and crafts. She could be a priestess, a prophetess, a völva who was respected and feared. She could even be a warrior, although this was rare. Legends tell of shield maidens, female warriors who fought alongside men. Archaeology confirms that such women did exist. Graves of women with weapons, with battle wounds, have been found. But this was the exception, not the rule. Most women fought differently, with words, advice, support. A wife could push her husband to avenge an insult, could inspire a heroic deed, could shame cowardice. There were cases where women themselves avenged their slain relatives when the men hesitated. A widow received all of her husband's property until her sons came of age. She became the head of the family, a full-fledged mistress. She could remarry, or she could remain a widow and manage the household herself. There were wealthy, influential widows who were even listened to by jarls. Old women were held in special esteem. They were the keepers of wisdom and traditions. They taught their grandchildren, healed with herbs, gave advice. Their opinions were heeded. Of course, a woman's life was not easy. Childbirth was dangerous. Many died in childbirth or shortly after. There was a lot of work, maintaining the home, raising children, managing the household. But at the same time, a woman had rights, had a voice, had respect. This distinguished the Vikings from many other peoples of that time. And now about the structure of society. The Vikings were not equal among themselves. They had a hierarchy, quite rigid, although not as insurmountable as in some other societies. At the very bottom were the slaves, thralls. These were prisoners of war, people bought at markets, children of slaves, criminals sold into slavery for debt. A slave was the property of his master. He could be sold, given as a gift, or killed. He had no rights, could not own property, could not marry without his master's permission. Slaves performed the heaviest, dirtiest work. They plowed, dug, carried heavy loads, cleaned the byres. Female slaves worked in the kitchen, spun, wove, and cared for the children. The master could use a female slave as a concubine, and her children were also slaves, unless he acknowledged them. But a slave could be freed, for a ransom, for faithful service, at the will of the master. A freed slave became a freedman, a lysinger. He was now free, but not yet a full-fledged member of society. He had to serve his former master, to help him. But his children were born free. Above the slaves were the carls, free people. This was the main mass of the population: peasants, craftsmen, merchants, sailors, ordinary warriors. A carl owned property, a farm, tools, weapons. He had rights. He could participate in the thing, the popular assembly. He could sue in court. He could carry weapons. A carl was the head of his family, the master of his house. He could be rich or poor, but he was free. No one could order him around unless he served voluntarily. No one could take his property without a decision of the thing. There were differences among the carls. A wealthy peasant who owned a large farm, had many cattle, several slaves. He was a bondi, a respectable man. A poor peasant, barely making ends meet. He was also a carl, but his voice was quieter. Some carls became house-carls, members of a retinue. They served a jarl or a konung, receiving weapons, food, and a share of the spoils from him. They swore an oath of loyalty, promising to fight for their lord until death. A house-carl had honor, had status. He was a warrior, not just a peasant. Even higher stood the nobility. the Jarls. A Jarl was the ruler of a region, a military commander, a judge. He came from a noble family, owned extensive lands, and had many people in his service. A Jarl gathered a retinue, waged wars, hosted feasts, and distributed gifts. The well-being of everyone who lived in his lands depended on his generosity and wisdom. A Jarl was not an absolute ruler. He had to consult with the bondis, with the thing. But his word carried weight. He could call people to war, could judge disputes, could make alliances on behalf of his people. And finally, at the top stood the konung, the king. But a konung of the Viking Age was not like the medieval kings of later times. He was not an absolute monarch. He was, rather, the first among equals, the strongest of the jarls. A konung was chosen at the thing from among the noblemen, usually from one family considered royal. The eldest son was not automatically chosen. They chose the one who seemed most worthy, strong, generous, and wise. A konung had to prove his right to rule, with victories in battles, successful campaigns, rich spoils. A konung maintained a large retinue. He distributed gifts, gold, silver, weapons, lands. He hosted feasts where his retainers ate, drank, and listened to skalds. In return, they swore loyalty to him, promised to fight and die for him. The relationship between a konung and his retainer was personal, almost familial. It was not an impersonal service, it was mutual devotion. The konung cared for his men, and they gave their lives for him. Betrayal from either side was considered a terrible disgrace. The thing, the popular assembly, was the most important institution of Viking society. All free men of the region gathered at the thing to decide important matters, to judge crimes, settle disputes, pass laws, elect a konung. The thing was held in a specific place, often a sacred one. Everyone came armed. It was an assembly of free warriors. They spoke in turn, trying to persuade others of their rightness. Decisions were made by the majority. They would strike their weapons against their shields as a sign of agreement. The law was transmitted orally. There was a special person, the law speaker, who knew all the laws by heart and recited them at the thing. These laws were called the law, and they regulated all aspects of life. How to divide an inheritance, how much to pay for a killing, how to make deals, how to marry and divorce. Crimes were punished with fines, vergild, compensation to the victim or his relatives. A large fine was paid for a killing, a smaller one for an injury, depending on its severity. Fines were also paid for theft and insults. If the criminal could not or would not pay, he was declared an outlaw. Then anyone could kill him with impunity. Exile was a terrible punishment. An exile lost the protection of the law, lost his homeland, family, and friends. He had to leave the country and could not return under penalty of death. Many exiles went overseas, seeking a new homeland in distant lands. Revenge was part of the system. If someone killed your relative, you had to take revenge or at least receive compensation. Otherwise, shame fell upon the entire clan. A blood feud could last for generations until a way was found to reconcile or until one of the clans was completely destroyed. Honor was above all else. The honor of the clan, the honor of the family, personal honor. An insult to honor demanded a response. Cowardice, betrayal, lies, all these disgraced a person and his clan forever. It was better to die than to live in shame. The sagas are full of stories of people who chose death over dishonor. The family was the foundation of society. The extended family, the sib, included all relatives by blood and marriage. They were all bound by mutual responsibility. If one committed a crime, all paid for it. If one needed help, all came to the rescue. If one was killed, all sought revenge. This system created strong bonds, but it also generated endless strife. Saga after saga tells of blood feuds, of long-standing conflicts between clans, of cunning plans and sudden killings. But the same system gave a person protection, gave a sense of belonging to something greater than himself. A Viking's life was determined by his place in society, but it was not limited by it. A slave could become free. A poor carl could get rich on a successful raid. An ordinary warrior could become famous in battle and become a jarl's housecarl. A jarl could become a konung. An exile could found his own kingdom overseas. Society was rigid but mobile. The main thing was to prove one's valor, strength, generosity, and wisdom. The main thing was to earn respect, and then you would be accepted, whatever your origin. This is how the Vikings lived, in longhouses among the fjords, on farms where every stone had to be dug out by hand, in trading cities where people from all over the world met, in the retinues of konungs where fame was forged, in families where the memory of ancestors was preserved and new generations were raised. Their life was full of labor and danger, but it was their life, and they lived it as they saw fit, with honor, with dignity, bowing their heads to no one but the gods and fate. Now let's try to understand why. Why, at the end of the 8th century, did peaceful Scandinavian peasants suddenly take up arms and set out to plunder and conquer the world? What made them leave their farms, families, and familiar lives and venture into the unknown? History does not tolerate simple answers. There are always many reasons intertwined with each other. Economics, politics, culture, sheer chance, all of these form one large picture. And the Viking Age is no exception. Imagine Scandinavia at the end of the 8th century. Several centuries of relatively peaceful life have passed. The climate was mild. Scientists call this period the medieval climatic optimum. It was warmer than before. Crops could be grown further north, further up in the mountains. Agriculture flourished. And when there is enough food, the population grows. And it grew. Families were large. 5, 7, 10 children were not uncommon. Medicine was primitive. Many children died in infancy, but those who survived grew up strong. There were few wars, few epidemics. There were more and more people. And this is where the problem began. It was particularly acute in Norway. Look at a map of Norway. It's a narrow strip of land, wedged between the sea and the mountains. There are few fertile valleys. They are small, scattered among the fjords and cliffs. Arable land was catastrophically scarce. Of course, one could cultivate new plots, clear forests, uproot stumps, remove stones from the fields. And they did. But the possibilities for expansion were limited. The forest came down to the sea, rose into the mountains. Beyond the forest began the tundra, perpetual snows. Nothing would grow there, and the family grows. A peasant has 10 children. According to tradition, all the property, the entire farm, goes to the eldest son. This was called Odal, ancestral land that could not be divided, could not be sold to outsiders. The eldest son became the master, continuing his father's work. And the other 9? The daughters married, went to other families. But the sons? They also had to arrange their lives somehow. Some stayed on the family farm, working for their brother as laborers. Some tried to win a piece of land from the forest and stones to start their own small farm. But many did not succeed. And what was left? To become a mercenary for a jarl, hoping for a share of the spoils, to hire oneself out as a worker to a richer neighbor, or to go overseas to where, according to rumors, there were rich lands, poorly defended cities, gold and silver just lying in monasteries, waiting to be taken. Overpopulation affected not only the younger sons. When there are many people and little land, crop yields fall. The soil becomes exhausted if it is plowed year after year without rest. A year of bad harvest could mean famine, and several bad harvest years in a row, a catastrophe. People had nothing to eat. Livestock had to be slaughtered, seed stock eaten. By spring, only bones and despair remained. In such times, any way out seemed like a salvation. And if a man appeared who said, "Brothers, there is nothing for us here. Let's build a ship and sail to where there is plenty of food and wealth," people followed him, because there was nothing to lose. Sweden and Denmark were in a slightly better position. There was more land there, the climate was milder. But there, too, the population grew, and there, too, not everyone had a place under the sun. And there, too, younger sons sought their fortune overseas. Political reasons were added to the economic ones. Scandinavia at that time was not united. There was no kingdom of Norway, no kingdom of Sweden, no kingdom of Denmark in our understanding. There were many small domains, each ruled by its own konung or jarl. In Norway, there were several dozen such petty kingdoms. Each valley, each fjord had its own ruler. They constantly fought with each other, made alliances, betrayed, and seized neighboring lands. It was political fragmentation in its purest form. A young, ambitious jarl wanted to expand his domains, increase his wealth, and strengthen his power. But his neighbors were also strong, also wanted the same thing. War with a neighbor was risky. One could lose everything. And a raid overseas? There, the opponents were weaker, the riches greater, and in case of failure, one could always return home. Those who did not want to submit to the power of the local jarl, who were dissatisfied with his rule, who feared revenge, who simply loved freedom, they also went to sea. They became Vikings, free adventurers. They had no master except the elected leader of the expedition. They divided the spoils equally, lived by their own laws. There were also those who had lost in the political struggle. Exiles, those defeated in internal strife, who had lost their lands. The way home was closed to them. Staying nearby was dangerous. All that remained was to go overseas. Many of them later founded their own domains in distant lands, became rulers of conquered territories. In the 9th century, the process of unifying Norway began. Harald Fairhair, whom we will talk about later, began to subdue one kingdom after another, striving to create a united Norway. Many jarls and bondis did not want to submit to him. They saw him as a tyrant who was taking away their ancient freedoms. And what did they do? They boarded their ships and sailed away. Some to Iceland, where no king could order them around. Some to the islands west of Scotland, some to Ireland, where they could found their own state. The unification of Norway, paradoxically, led to a new wave of emigration, to new Viking raids. In Denmark and Sweden, the unification process proceeded in a similar way, although with its own peculiarities. There, too, were jarls who did not wish to submit to the strengthening konungs. There, too, were exiles and the discontented, and they, too, sought their fortune overseas. But there was another reason, perhaps the most important one: the thirst for wealth and fame. For a Viking, these were not just words. This was the meaning of life. You see, a Viking believed that the only thing that would survive death was fame. Everything else would disappear. Your body would rot or burn. Your property would go to your children. Your house would fall apart. But if you did something great, if skalds would sing about you, if your name would be remembered, then you would become immortal. Cattle die, kinsmen die, and you yourself will die. But I know one thing that never dies: the fame of a dead man's deeds, says the ancient Havamal, a collection of wisdom attributed to Odin. Every Viking knew these words from childhood. They defined his life. Fame was won in battle, on raids, in heroic deeds. Staying at home, plowing the land, raising children, this was necessary and honorable, but it did not bring fame. Fame was brought by raids, battles, discoveries. Fame was brought by wealth, brought from distant lands. Fame was brought by generosity, the ability to host a feast, to distribute gifts to the retinue. A young man wanted to prove himself, to prove to his father that he was no worse than his older brothers, to prove to a girl that he was worthy of her, to prove to his comrades that they could go through fire and water with him. How to do this? Go on a raid, return with spoils, tell of his deeds at a feast, and if you were lucky, a song would be composed about you. A skald would tell of how you fought, how you took cities, how you were not afraid when enemies surrounded you from all sides. And this song would be sung at feasts, would be passed down by word of mouth, and in 100, 200, 300 years, people would still remember your name. Wealth was also important, but not wealth for its own sake, not hoarding. A Viking did not hoard gold in chests. He distributed it. He gave it to his men, hosted feasts, bought weapons, built ships. Generosity was a virtue, greed a vice. A konung or jarl who did not share the spoils with his retinue quickly lost it. The warriors would go to a more generous lord. Ring-breaker, giver of gold, enemy of treasure. That's what a good ruler was called. He broke rings, broke golden bracelets into pieces to distribute among his warriors. He was an enemy of treasure because he did not keep it for himself. And in order to give, one had to take from somewhere. One's own farm in Norway provided only food, and not always enough of that. One had to go to where there was gold, silver, jewels. To the monasteries of England, where the gifts of the faithful had accumulated for centuries. To the cities of France, where merchants stored their goods. To the East, where Arab merchants paid in silver for furs and slaves. Technological progress also played its part. By the end of the 8th century, the Scandinavians had learned to build true ocean-going ships. The drakkar was a revolution in shipbuilding. Before it, there were only coastal vessels on which it was dangerous to go far from the shore. The drakkar was different, long, narrow, with a high raised bow and stern, with one large square sail made of wool soaked in fat or tar, with rows of oars along the sides, from 20 to 30 pairs, depending on the size of the ship, with a flexible hull that bent with the waves but did not break. On such a ship, one could cross the North Sea, reach England, Ireland, France. One could sail up rivers, reaching the very heart of Europe. One could cross the Atlantic, reach Iceland, Greenland, even America. And at the same time, the drakkar was quite light. It could be pulled ashore if a storm needed to be weathered. It could be portaged overland from one river to another. Its draft was so shallow that it could enter river mouths inaccessible to other ships of that time. With such a ship, the world opened up. What had previously been unattainable became possible. England, just a few days' journey. France, a little further. The Mediterranean, a long journey, but a real one. The Russian rivers, a path to the east, to the countless riches of Byzantium and the East. Navigation also improved. The Vikings did not know the compass, did not have accurate maps, but they were magnificent seafarers. They knew how to read the stars, to follow the sun even on cloudy days. They knew the habits of birds. If birds flew west, it meant there was land there. They watched whales, seals, the color of the water, the temperature. They memorized landmarks. From Bergen, west, for 3 days' sail, you will see 2 high cliffs. Those are the Shetland Islands. From there, another day west, the Faroe Islands. From there, 4 days west and a little north, Iceland. This is how knowledge was passed down from father to son, from captain to sailor. They even used a sunstone, Iceland spar, a mineral that showed the position of the sun even through clouds due to the polarization of light. Archaeologists long considered this a legend, but recently found evidence that it was indeed used. With such knowledge, with such ships, the fear of the ocean receded. The sea ceased to be an insurmountable barrier. It became a road, a path to wealth and fame, and information spread. The first raids on Lindisfarne, on other monasteries, were tentative, random. But when the Vikings returned home with spoils, with stories of poorly defended, wealthy places, everyone heard. The next year, more ships set out. The year after that, even more. It was a chain reaction. Success bred new campaigns. Young men saw their comrades return rich and respected, saw the golden bracelets on their arms, the silver cups at their feasts, heard the skalds' songs about their deeds, and they thought, why not me? I can do it too. I also want fame and wealth. Famous leaders appeared. Ragnar Lodbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Guthrum, names that struck terror throughout Europe. Warriors from all over Scandinavia flocked to them. Young adventurers, experienced warriors, exiles, simple fortune seekers. They assembled fleets of hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors, and the Europeans could do nothing to oppose them. They were not ready. Their armies were slow, unwieldy. Their kings were constantly at war with each other. The Vikings were fast, mobile, unpredictable. They appeared out of nowhere, plundered, burned, and disappeared before anyone could organize a defense. Monasteries were particularly easy prey. They were located on the coast, on islands, at river mouths, in places convenient for Viking ships. They were rich. Centuries of accumulating gifts from the faithful, gold and silver crosses, jewel-encrusted gospels, church utensils. And they were defenseless. Monks did not carry weapons, had no warriors. For the Vikings, this was a no-lose situation. Low risk, high reward. They did not understand the sanctity of these places. For them, they were just storehouses of gold that, for some reason, no one guarded. The Christian God was alien to them. Sacrilege did not stop them. Cities were also attractive, although more dangerous. There were walls, warriors, but the loot was richer there. Trading cities like London, Paris, Hamburg had accumulated enormous wealth. The Vikings quickly learned how to take them, sometimes by storm, sometimes by cunning, sometimes they simply laid siege and demanded a ransom. Danegeld, Danish money, became the curse of Europe. Kings and cities paid the Vikings huge sums just to get them to sail away. But this did not solve the problem. On the contrary, the Vikings returned again and again, demanding more and more. After all, why risk a battle if you can get gold just by threatening? The East offered other opportunities. There, the Vikings were called Varangians, and there they were not so much robbers as merchants and mercenaries. They sailed along the rivers, the Volkhov, the Dnieper, the Volga. They founded trading settlements. They exchanged northern goods, furs, amber, walrus tusks, slaves, for eastern ones, silk, silver, spices. The journey was long and dangerous. Ships had to be dragged over rapids. One had to negotiate or fight with local tribes. One had to endure heat, mosquitoes, unfamiliar food. But at the end of the journey was Byzantium, Constantinople, the richest city in the world at that time. Or Baghdad, the capital of the Arab Caliphate, where silver flowed like a river. Arab silver dirhams are found all over Scandinavia. Hundreds of hoards, thousands of coins. These are traces of the Eastern trade, traces of the wealth that the Vikings brought from their distant travels. There were also those who sought not wealth, but land for settlement, where they could start a new life. Iceland was discovered in the mid-9th century, an uninhabited island, covered with lava fields and glaciers, but with green valleys along the coast. Those who did not want to live under the rule of a unifying Norway went there. They founded farms, created a free society without kings. Greenland was discovered later, at the end of the 10th century. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for murder, found land there and gave it an attractive name, Greenland, although there was little green there. But he wanted to attract settlers, and the name worked. Even America, Vinland, as the Vikings called it, was a settlement target. Leif Erikson and his men tried to found a colony there around the year 1000. It did not work out. It was too far from home. The locals were too hostile. But they tried. All these reasons, economic, political, cultural, technological, were intertwined. There was no single cause. There was a combination of factors that created a perfect storm. Overpopulation pushed people to seek new lands. Political fragmentation created exiles and the discontented. The thirst for fame called for distant campaigns. New ships made these campaigns possible. The weakness of European defense made them profitable. And the age began. 3 centuries when Scandinavians sailed all the seas, reached all the shores, left their mark everywhere. 3 centuries when the prayer, "From the fury of the Northmen deliver us, O Lord," was heard in every church in Europe. 3 centuries that changed the world. The Vikings went not only to plunder, they went to seek a better life. They went to prove to themselves and others that they were worth something. They went because staying at home when a whole world lay across the sea was impossible for them. They were adventurers, pioneers, conquerors, merchants, settlers. They were Vikings, and the world would never be the same again. Now let's go on a voyage with the Vikings. Let's imagine what it was like to leave the native shore astern and set a course for the unknown. Where did they sail? What did they find there? How did they change the world with their campaigns? Let's start with the day that marked the beginning of the era, June 8th, 793. The small island of Lindisfarne off the northeastern coast of England. A quiet morning, mist over the water. The monks at the monastery of St. Cuthbert begin their day with prayer. Suddenly, shouts. Long ships with dragon heads on their prows crash onto the shore. Armed men jump out of them, tall, bearded, in chainmail and helmets, with axes and swords in their hands. They speak an incomprehensible language. Their faces are cruel. The monks try to flee. They pray. They beg for mercy. But the attackers have no concern for prayers. They burst into the church, grab golden crosses, silver chalices, jewel-encrusted gospels. They break the altar, tear the rich fabrics. They kill those who resist or simply get in their way. The young and strong are bound. They will be useful as slaves. By noon, it is all over. The ships cast off, laden with spoils. On the island remain smoking ruins, the bodies of the dead and the grief-stunned survivors. Christian Europe is shocked. Pagans have desecrated a holy place, killed God's servants, plundered a church. Alcuin, a learned monk at the court of Charlemagne, writes, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain." He asks, "Whence have come such troubles? What have we done to deserve this?" He sees the raid as God's punishment for sins. But the Vikings didn't care about these reasonings. They had found an easy source of wealth and intended to use it. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. In the following years, the raids became more frequent. The Vikings, mostly Norwegians and Danes, attacked the coasts of England, Scotland, and Ireland. They chose monasteries and churches, rich and defenseless. Iona, a sacred island off the west coast of Scotland, was attacked in 795, and then several more times. The monks had to flee inland, taking the relics of saints with them. At first, these were hit-and-run raids. They would swoop in, plunder, and sail away. But gradually, the Vikings became bolder. They began to stay for the winter, establishing temporary bases. They studied the terrain, learned where the riches were, how best to attack. Britain at that time was fragmented. England consisted of several kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Kent. They were constantly at war with each other. Scotland was divided between the Picts, Scots, and Britons. Ireland consisted of many petty kingdoms, constantly feuding. The Vikings exploited this fragmentation. They made alliances with some against others. They hired themselves out as mercenaries. They interfered in internal strife. And gradually, from raiders, they turned into conquerors. In 865, the great heathen army arrived in England, a huge Viking force under the command of the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok. They did not intend to just plunder. They wanted to conquer, and they conquered. Within a few years, Northumbria, East Anglia, and most of Mercia fell. The Vikings established their own kingdoms, seized lands, and imposed tribute on the conquered. Only Wessex, the kingdom in the southwest, resisted under the leadership of King Alfred, who would later be called the Great. Alfred was clever and persistent. He suffered defeats, fled, hid in the marshes. But he did not give up. He gathered an army, learned from his enemies, built fortresses and a fleet. In the end, he managed to stop the Vikings and make peace with them. England was divided. The south and west remained Anglo-Saxon, while the north and east became the Danelaw, the area of Danish law. In the Danelaw, the Vikings settled, mixed with the locals, and founded cities. York became a Scandinavian center. Dublin in Ireland also became a Viking city, an important trading port. The Orkney and Shetland Islands, the Hebrides off the west coast of Scotland, all these became Scandinavian. The Vikings did not just plunder Britain, they changed it. Hundreds of Scandinavian words entered the English language, place names ending in by, settlement, thorp, village, toft, homestead. All of these are of Scandinavian origin. The laws of the Danelaw, the features of local self-government, the influence of the Vikings. And this was only one side of the expansion. In parallel, the Vikings descended upon the Frankish Empire. The Frankish state, created by Charlemagne, fell apart after his death. Charlemagne's grandsons fought with each other, dividing the inheritance. The borders were undefended, the armies scattered, an ideal target. The Vikings, mostly Danes and Norwegians, began to sail up the rivers into the heart of the country. The Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, wide, navigable rivers led to rich cities. Dracars were perfectly suited for river navigation. Their shallow draft allowed them to go where larger ships could not. In 845, a fleet of Vikings sailed up the Seine to Paris. They captured the city, plundered it, and demanded a ransom. King Charles the Bald paid 7,000 pounds of silver just to make them leave. But the Vikings realized they could take money without even fighting, just by threatening. They returned again and again. Paris was besieged in 885 through 886. That time, the city held out for almost a year, with the defense led by Count Odo. The Vikings could not take the fortified bridges over the Seine and eventually retreated. But the king had to pay again. The Frankish rulers tried various ways to deal with the problem. They paid Danegeld, but that only attracted more Vikings. They hired some Vikings against others, but they often switched to the side that paid more. They tried to build fortifications on the rivers, but the Vikings found ways around them or simply carried their ships overland. Eventually, the rulers took a radical step. They gave the Vikings land. In 911, the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, made a treaty with the Viking leader Rollo. Rollo received lands at the mouth of the Seine in his possession, pledging to defend them from other Vikings and to accept Christianity. Thus, Normandy was born, the land of the Northmen. Rollo became its first duke. The Vikings settled there, mixed with the local Franks, adopted the French language and customs, but they retained their warlike spirit. A century and a half later, their descendant, William the Conqueror, would conquer England in 1066. But that is another story. The Vikings even reached the Mediterranean. They sailed around Spain, where they fought with both Muslims and Christians, plundering both coasts. They broke through the Strait of Gibraltar and appeared in the Mediterranean Sea. They attacked the coast of Africa, Italy. They reached Byzantium, where they were both feared and valued as mercenaries. But there were other directions. The Swedish Vikings looked not to the west, but to the east. The Baltic Sea was their highway. They crossed it, landed on the eastern shore, in the lands inhabited by Finns, Balts, and Slavs. They sailed up the rivers, the Neva, the Volkhov, the western Dvina. They founded trading settlements, fortresses. Ladoga, on the Volkhov River near Lake Ladoga, became one of the first such settlements. Archaeologists find Scandinavian buildings, weapons, and jewelry from the 8th and 9th centuries there. It was an outpost, a trading base, from which the Varangians moved further east and south. Novgorod, according to legend, was founded or captured by the Varangian prince Rurik in 862. The chronicle tells that the local tribes, Slavs, Finns, Krivichs, invited the Varangians to rule because they could not agree among themselves. "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." How much of this is truth and how much is a legend created to justify Varangian rule, historians still debate. But the fact remains, Scandinavians played an important role in the early history of Rus. They were merchants, warriors, rulers. They mixed with the Slavs, adopted their language and culture, but also brought their own. From Novgorod, the path went further, along the Lovat River, then by portage to the Dnieper, down the Dnieper, past the rapids, dangerous rocky shoals where they had to unload the ships and drag them along the shore, past the steppes where the Pechenegs and other tribes roamed, with whom one had to negotiate or fight, and finally, the Black Sea, and beyond it, Constantinople, Tsargrad, as it was called in Rus. The Byzantine capital, the richest city in the world at that time, walls 20 meters high, huge basilicas with golden domes, palaces, markets where one could buy anything in the world. The Varangians sailed there to trade. They brought furs, amber, wax, honey, slaves. They bought silk, spices, wine, glassware, weapons. The Byzantines called them Rus, possibly from the Finnish ruotsi, meaning rowers, people on oars. But the Varangians did not only trade. Sometimes they attacked Byzantium itself. In 860, a fleet of Russes besieged Constantinople. In 907, according to the chronicle, Prince Oleg nailed his shield to the gates of Tsargrad, concluding a favorable trade agreement. In 941, Prince Igor attacked again, but was repelled by Greek fire, a liquid fire that burned on water. Gradually, relations stabilized. Byzantium hired Varangians into its army. The Varangian Guard became an elite unit of the Byzantine emperors. Tall northern warriors with battle axes guarded the emperor, were his personal guard. Service there was honorable and profitable, and adventurers from all over Scandinavia sought to join it. There was another route to the east, along the Volga. From Ladoga, one could reach the Volga through a system of rivers and portages. The Volga flowed south to the Caspian Sea. Along its banks lay the lands of the Volga Bulgars, further on, the lands of the Khazar Khaganate, and even further south, the Arab Caliphate, where powerful caliphs ruled in Baghdad. The Arabs were rich. They mined silver in their mines, minted coins. dirhams. They needed furs for clothing, slaves for their homes and armies, amber for jewelry. The Varangians brought all this, receiving silver in return. A huge amount of Arab silver flowed north. Hoards of Arab coins are found all over Sweden, in the Baltics, in Rus. Hundreds of hoards, tens of thousands of coins. This is physical evidence of the scale of the trade. Silver-enriched Scandinavia provided the means to forge weapons, make jewelry, and mint their own coins. The Varangians in the east were different from the Vikings in the west. In the west, they plundered more. In the east, they traded more. Of course, they sometimes plundered there too. They raided the Caspian coast, the rich cities. But for the most part, they preferred peaceful trade. It was more profitable and safer. Thus, the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks was formed, a trade route that connected Scandinavia with Byzantium through the Russian rivers. It operated for several centuries, enriching everyone on it and promoting the exchange not only of goods, but also of ideas and cultures. And then there were the discoveries in the West, discoveries of new lands, where there were no cities to plunder, no enemies to fight, just empty lands waiting for settlers. Iceland was known to Irish monks even before the Vikings. They reached it in their fragile leather boats, founded small hermitages, prayed in solitude. But when the Vikings began to arrive in the mid-9th century, the monks left. The island was left to the Scandinavians. The first settlers arrived in the 870s. They found an unusual land. Volcanoes and glaciers, geysers and hot springs, lava fields and green valleys, harsh but habitable. There were no trees, only low shrubs, but there were pastures for sheep and cattle, fish in the sea, birds on the cliffs. The settlers established farms. Each claimed as much land as he could walk around in a day with a torch. As long as the torch burned, the land was considered his. Thus, the entire island was divided among several thousand households. It is important that the people who went to Iceland were free. Not the poor who had nothing to lose, but bondis who had the means to relocate. Many were fleeing the unification of Norway under Harald Fairhair. They did not want to submit to a king, to lose their ancient freedoms. In Iceland, they founded a society without a king. In 930, the Icelanders established the Althing, a general popular assembly. Once a year, all free men gathered at Thingvellir, in a picturesque place where the tectonic plates of Europe and America are pulling apart, forming a rift valley. There they decided on laws, judged disputes, and elected a law speaker. The Althing was one of the first parliaments in Europe. It operated for centuries, becoming a symbol of Icelandic freedom and independence. Iceland is proud of it to this day. From Iceland, the Vikings sailed further west. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for murder, explored a huge island to the west in 982. He found fjords there, similar to those in Norway, narrow strips of green land along the coast. Inland lay an ice sheet kilometers thick, but it was possible to live on the edges. Eric named the island Greenland, the Greenland. In part, it really was green in the summer. In part, it was an advertisement. He wanted to attract settlers. The name worked. In 985 or 986, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships there. 14 reached their destination. The rest were lost at sea or turned back. The settlers founded 2 colonies, the eastern and western settlements, on opposite shores of the southern tip of Greenland. They raised sheep and cows, hunted seals and whales, and gathered bird eggs. They traded with Iceland and Norway, exporting walrus tusks, polar bear skins, and live falcons. Life was hard. The climate was harsher than in Iceland. There was less land. The population never exceeded a few thousand people. But the colony survived for almost 500 years until it disappeared in the 15th century, when the climate grew colder and ties with Europe were severed. And Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, went even further. Around the year 1000, he sailed west from Greenland and found new lands. First, he saw rocky shores, glaciers. He named this place Helluland, land of flat stones. Most likely this was Baffin Island or Labrador. Then wooded shores. He named it Markland, land of forests. Probably the coast of Labrador or Newfoundland. And finally, a place with a mild climate, where grass grew, there were forests, and fish were plentiful. Wild grapes, or some berries similar to grapes, even grew there. Leif named this place Vinland, land of wine. This was America, 500 years before Columbus. Leif and his men built houses and wintered over. They explored the surroundings. They gathered timber and berries. In the spring, they returned to Greenland with a cargo of wood and stories of the new land. Where exactly was Vinland? Archaeologists debated for a long time. In the 1960s, Norwegian archaeologists found the remains of a Scandinavian settlement in Newfoundland at the northern tip of the island at a place called Lance aux Meadows. Longhouses of a typical Viking type, a smithy, and objects of Scandinavian origin. This was proof. The Vikings really did reach America. They were the first Europeans to set foot on this land. True, they did not realize the scale of their discovery. For them, it was just another land, suitable or unsuitable for settlement. They did not stay there, did not change the course of American history. But they were the first. Over the 3 centuries of the Viking Age, the Scandinavians sailed all the seas of the North Atlantic. They reached Greenland, America in the west, Baghdad and the Caspian Sea in the east, the Mediterranean in the south. They founded kingdoms in England, Ireland, Normandy, and Rus. They discovered Iceland, settled it, and created a unique society there. They were not just robbers, although they did plunder. They were explorers, merchants, settlers. They expanded the boundaries of the known world. They connected distant lands with trade routes. They mixed cultures, languages, peoples. The legacy of the Vikings remains everywhere. In place, names, in the words of languages, in the genes of populations. Descendants of the Vikings live in England, Ireland, and France. In Rus, the princes traced their lineage from the Varangians. In Iceland, the descendants of the first settlers still live on the same lands that their ancestors claimed more than 1,000 years ago. The world became different thanks to their voyages, smaller, closer, more connected. Europe learned of the existence of distant lands. Trade flourished. Ideas traveled along with goods. The Viking Age was an age of discovery, an age of expanding horizons. And it all began with a few ships that cast off from the Scandinavian shores in search of wealth and fame. With people who were not afraid to challenge the ocean. With the Vikings. The Vikings were not only robbers and traders, they were also builders. Builders of cities, creators of states, founders of dynasties. Wherever they went, they often stayed. They settled, mixed with the local population, and created something new, neither purely Scandinavian nor purely local, but something special, unique. Let's take a journey through the cities that the Vikings founded or changed so much that they became different. Let's see how a handful of northerners could change the fate of entire countries. Let's start with Ireland, the Green Isle on the western edge of Europe, a land of mists and legends. Before the Vikings, there were no cities in the usual sense. There were monasteries, centers of learning and culture. There were royal residences, fortified homesteads where a king lived with his retinue. But there were no trading cities, no ports where urban life thrived. Ireland was fragmented into many petty kingdoms. The kings constantly fought with each other, made short-lived alliances, betrayed one another. There was no common unity. This made the island easy prey for the Vikings. The first raids began at the end of the 8th century. The Vikings, mostly Norwegians, attacked the coast, plundered monasteries, and left. But gradually they began to stay for the winter, building fortified camps, long forts. From temporary camps, these places turned into permanent settlements. Dublin arose in just this way. Around 840, Norwegian Vikings founded a long fort at the mouth of the river Liffey on the east coast of Ireland. The location was convenient: a deep harbor protected from storms, a river leading inland, and hills around for defense. The settlement grew. The Vikings were joined by Irishmen, merchants, craftsmen, simply those seeking a better life. Dublin became a trading center. Goods were brought there from Scandinavia, from England, from distant eastern countries. Irish goods were exported from there: wool, leather, cattle, and slaves. Dublin became one of the largest slave markets in Europe. The city was Scandinavian in spirit, but mixed in population. The Vikings married Irish women, taught their children both Irish and Norwegian. They adopted Christianity, but long retained Scandinavian customs. They built Scandinavian-style houses, but decorated them with Irish ornaments. The Dublin Vikings created their own kingdom. It was independent of both the Irish kings and the Norwegian ones. The kings of Dublin, Ivar, Olaf, Sitrick, ruled for several generations. They interfered in Irish politics, made alliances, fought wars, and sometimes even laid claim to the high kingship over all of Ireland. The city was captured several times by Irish kings, but the Vikings reclaimed it. It was too important, too rich to give up. Dublin flourished for 2.5 centuries until it was captured by the Anglo-Normans in 1171. But the legacy of the Vikings remained. Archaeologists have excavated entire quarters from the 10th and 11th centuries in Dublin. Wooden houses, workshops, log roads, thousands of objects, combs, jewelry, tools, playing dice, Scandinavian and Irish mixed together. It was a city of two cultures, a city where the North met the Celtic West. Modern Dublin is the capital of Ireland, but its name is Scandinavian. Dublin comes from the Irish Dublin, Black Pool, but the Irish themselves did not call the city that before the Vikings. The Vikings gave it a name that has remained forever. There were other Viking cities in Ireland: Wexford, Waterford, Limerick, Cork. They all began as Viking long forts and later became cities. They brought urban culture, trade, and crafts to Ireland. The irony is that the robbers became builders of civilization. Now let's move to England, to the north, to York. York was an ancient city even from Roman times. They called it Iberacum. A legion was stationed there. There were stone walls, a forum, and baths. After the Romans left, the city continued to exist. The Anglo-Saxons called it Eoforwic. It was the residence of the kings of Northumbria, an episcopal see. But in 866, the great heathen army arrived. The Vikings, under the leadership of Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, captured the city almost without a fight. They took advantage of the fact that the local kings were feuding with each other. York became the capital of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik. Under Scandinavian rule, the city was transformed. It became a trading center that rivaled London. The Vikings expanded the harbor on the River Ouse, built new warehouses and workshops. They attracted merchants from Scandinavia, Ireland, and the continent. Jorvik was like Hedeby or Birka, only on English soil. Narrow streets, tightly packed wooden houses, craftsmen's workshops. Archaeologists have excavated the Coppergate area, the street of coppersmiths. There were workshops there where they worked with metal, leather, bone, and amber. The finds are astonishingly diverse. jewelry, tools, coins, bones with food remains, even wooden toilets. The city was multinational. Scandinavians, Anglo-Saxons, Irish, and Frisians lived side by side. Languages mixed. An Anglo-Scandinavian dialect emerged where English and Norse words were intermingled. Many English words of Scandinavian origin came precisely from Jorvik and the Danelaw. The kings of Jorvik ruled for several generations. They minted coins, established laws, made treaties. Some converted to Christianity, but others returned to the old gods. It was an island of the Scandinavian world in the heart of England. In 954, the last Scandinavian king of Jorvik, Eric Bloodaxe, was expelled. The city became part of a united England, but the Scandinavian influence remained. The laws, customs, and language of York and the entire Danelaw region long retained Scandinavian features. When the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada attempted to conquer England in 1066, the inhabitants of York hesitated. Should they support their fellow Scandinavians or remain loyal to the English king? In the end, Harold was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge near York. It was the last attempt at a Scandinavian conquest of England. Modern York is one of the most beautiful cities in England. Beneath its streets lie the layers of Roman Eboracum, Anglo-Saxon Eoforwic, and Scandinavian Jorvik. The Viking period was an important part of its history, making it the trading and cultural center it became. Now let's travel east to the expanses of Rus. There, the Vikings, or Varangians, as they were called there, played a role that historians still argue about. Novgorod, a city on the Volkhov River, in the lands inhabited by the Slavic tribes of the Ilmen Slavs and Finnic tribes. According to the Chronicle, the city was founded or captured by the Varangian prince Rurik in 862. The Chronicle's story is this. The Slavic and Finnic tribes invited the Varangians to rule because they could not establish order themselves. "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." 3 brothers came, Rurik, Cineus, and Truvor. Rurik settled in Novgorod and became the first prince of the Rurik dynasty, which ruled Ruses until the end of the 16th century. How much of this is true? Most likely the story is embellished, created later to legitimize the Varangian dynasty. The reality was more complex. Varangians did indeed come, but not as peaceful rulers by invitation, but as conquerors or mercenaries. They seized power by force or cunning, then mixed with the local nobility, becoming part of the local society. But the fact remains, the Varangians played an important role in the early history of Rus. They were the military elite, the retinues of princes, traders on the eastern routes. They brought experience in state-building, warfare, and trade. Under the rule of the Rurikids, Novgorod became a major center. Trade between Scandinavia and the south, between the Baltic and Byzantium, passed through it. Novgorod merchants traveled to Constantinople, to Birka, to Gotland, all over the Baltic. The city grew rich, expanded, and was built up. Novgorod had a special political system. The prince was important, but not all-powerful. Real power belonged to the Veche, a popular assembly where all free citizens could speak and vote. The Veche elected the Posadnik, the head of the city administration, the Tisiatsky, the military commander, and even the archbishop. The prince was invited or expelled by the decision of the Veche. This system resembled the Scandinavian thing. It is possible that Varangian influence played a role in its formation. Novgorod was a republic, Lord Novgorod the Great, as it was called, where power was more distributed than in other Russian lands. Now Kiev. According to the Chronicle, it was captured in 882 by Prince Oleg, Rurik's successor. Oleg descended from Novgorod down the Dnieper, deceitfully killed the local Varangian princes Askold and Dir, and seized the city. He declared, "Let this be the mother of Rus's cities." Kiev became the capital of a new state, Kievan Rus. Kiev stood on the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. Whoever controlled Kiev controlled all trade along the Dnieper, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. This made it incredibly valuable. The Varangian princes understood this and held the city with an iron grip. Under their rule, Kiev grew. New fortifications, palaces, and churches were built after the adoption of Christianity. The city became the capital of a vast state, stretching from Ladoga to Kiev, from the Carpathians to the Volga. The Varangians in Kiev quickly became Slavicized. Rurik's grandson, Prince Sviatoslav, already bore a Slavic name and spoke a Slavic language, though he retained the martial traditions of his ancestors. His son Vladimir baptized Ruses in 988, introducing Byzantine Christianity. The Varangian dynasty became Russian, but the memory of its Varangian roots was preserved. Were the Varangians the founders of Rus? This is a debatable question. The Slavic tribes existed long before the arrival of the Varangians and had their own culture and society. The Varangians were a catalyst, a military elite that helped to unite the scattered tribes into a state. But the foundation was Slavic. The Varangians dissolved into them, adopted their language, culture, and faith, leaving only a dynasty and some traditions. Archaeology confirms the Scandinavian presence. In Kiev, Novgorod, and other cities of Rus, Scandinavian artifacts from the 8th to 10th centuries are found. Weapons, jewelry, amulets with images of Thor and Odin, burial mounds with typically Scandinavian grave goods. But there are not many of them, and they are mixed with local ones. This was not a mass colonization, but the presence of an elite that quickly assimilated. Ruses became a bridge between Scandinavia and Byzantium, between the north and the south. The Varangians played their part in creating this bridge, but they built it together with the Slavs, Finns, and other peoples. It was a joint creation where everyone made their own contribution. And finally, Iceland, a special case. There, the Vikings did not conquer someone else's land, did not mix with the local population. There, they created a society from scratch, in an empty place. Iceland was uninhabited, except for a few Irish hermit monks who fled with the arrival of the Vikings. The first settlers arrived in the 870s. Within a few decades, the entire island was occupied and divided among households. The settlers were free people. Many were fleeing the unification of Norway, unwilling to submit to Harald Fairhair. They brought with them a love of freedom, an unwillingness to tolerate a king over them. And in Iceland, they created a society without a king. There was no central authority, no capital in the usual sense. Each household was independent, but for resolving common issues, for justice, for making laws, something common was needed. In 930, the Icelanders created the Althing, a general popular assembly. It was a unique institution for its time. The Althing convened once a year, in the middle of summer, at Thingvellir. This is a place in southwestern Iceland where a valley is formed by the divergence of tectonic plates. The North American and Eurasian plates are pulling apart, creating a rift valley surrounded by cliffs. The place was not just convenient, it was dramatic, impressive, suitable for important decisions. For 2 weeks, everyone who could, farm owners, their families, servants, traveled there. They set up a camp of tents and temporary shelters. They brought food and goods for trade. The Althing was not just an assembly, it was a fair, a meeting place, a place where marriages were arranged, disputes were settled, and friendships were formed. The law speaker stood on the law rock, a cliff in the middle of the valley, and proclaimed the laws in a loud voice. All laws were transmitted orally. The law speaker had to know them by heart. Each year he recited 1/3 of all the laws, so that in 3 years all the laws were announced. The Althing judged crimes and settled disputes. Lawsuits were heard in public, for all to see. The parties presented their cases, brought witnesses, and argued. The assembly made a decision by majority. Those who agreed would strike their weapons against their shields. There was no executive power. There was no police force to arrest criminals. There was no army to enforce decisions. Everything was based on public opinion, on honor, on the mutual support of clans. If you were declared an outlaw, you became an outcast. Anyone could kill you with impunity. This was a terrible punishment in a small society where everyone knew everyone. The system worked surprisingly well. Iceland remained independent and self-governing for more than 3 centuries. The Althing operated continuously, year after year, resolving all issues without a king, without a central authority. In the year 1000, Christianity was adopted at the Althing. It was a dramatic decision. Iceland was divided. Some wanted to remain pagans, others to adopt Christianity. Civil war threatened. The law speaker, Thorgir, himself a pagan, took it upon himself to make the decision. He went under his cloak for a day, lay down, and thought. Then he came out and announced, "Iceland will be Christian to preserve peace, but old customs, eating horse meat, leaving infants to die if the family could not feed them, secretly worshipping the old gods, would not be punished." The decision was accepted. Iceland became Christian peacefully, without bloodshed, without violence. It was a unique example of a peaceful religious transition. The Althing still exists today. The modern Icelandic parliament traces its history back to the Althing of 930. It is considered one of the oldest parliaments in the world. Icelanders are incredibly proud of this. It is part of their national identity. Thingvellir is now a national park. Tourists come there, look at the Law Rock, at the rift between the plates, and imagine how 1,000 years ago the Vikings gathered here, decided their affairs, argued, and made laws. What do all these places have in common? Dublin, York, Kiev, Novgorod, Iceland. The Vikings came as warriors, robbers, conquerors, but they remained as builders. They founded cities, created states, established laws. They were not only destroyers, but also creators. Their legacy lives on. Dublin is the capital of Ireland, but it was founded by the Vikings. York is an English city, but its flourishing is linked to the Vikings. Kiev and Novgorod are Russian cities, but their dynasties began with the Varangians. Iceland is an independent state, proud of its Viking heritage. The Vikings showed that it is possible to start from scratch, that you can come to a foreign land, settle down, and create something new and lasting, that you can mix with the locals, adopt their language and faith, but leave your own mark, that you can found a city that will outlive you by 1,000 years. It was an era not only of swords and ships, it was an era of cities and laws, of trade and culture, an era when the foundations of future Europe were being laid. And the Vikings were an important part of this process. They didn't just plunder and leave, they built and stayed. And what they built still stands today. The history of the Viking Age is not only a history of peoples and states, it is also a history of individuals, specific people with their characters, ambitions, and dreams, people who made choices and changed the course of history. Let's get to know some of them. Those whose names have survived the centuries, whose deeds are still remembered today. Let's start with the most mysterious, the most legendary, with a man about whom so many stories are told that it is no longer possible to separate fact from fiction. With Ragnar Lodbrok, Ragnar Hairy Breeches, that's how his nickname translates. Lodbrok, or Lodbrok, means hairy breeches, which, according to legend, saved him from a snake bite. Or they were leather breeches. Interpretations vary. But the name stuck, became a legend. Did Ragnar really exist? Probably, yes. There was likely a Danish konung or jarl in the 9th century who raided England and France. But we know about him mainly from the sagas, written 300 years after his death. The sagas blend several historical figures, add legends, and turn a man into an epic hero. According to the sagas, Ragnar was a great warrior and konung. He performed incredible feats, defeated dragons, or rather giant snakes, and conquered kingdoms. He had several wives, each a story in herself. His first wife, Lagertha, was a shield maiden, a warrior. She fought alongside men, was strong and fearless. Ragnar fell in love with her for her bravery, married her, but later left her for another. His second wife, Thora, was a jarl's daughter. According to legend, her father gave her a small snake as a pet. The snake grew to an enormous size, and no one could approach it. Her father promised to give his daughter to whoever killed the snake. Ragnar made leather breeches, soaked in tar so the snake couldn't bite him. He killed the snake, got the bride and the nickname. His third wife, Aslaug, was the daughter of the legendary hero Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. She bore Ragnar several sons, each of whom became a famous warrior. Ragnar's sons are a legend in themselves. Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, Hvitserk, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Ubba. Each received a nickname for some characteristic. Ivar was called the Boneless, perhaps due to a bone disease, but this did not stop him from becoming the greatest military commander. Or the nickname meant flexibility, cunning. Interpretations vary. Ragnar, according to the sagas, raided all over Europe. He sailed up the Seine, besieged Paris. He plundered England. He reached the Mediterranean. He was victorious everywhere, feared everywhere. But in the end, fate caught up with him. He went to England with a small army. His ships were wrecked in a storm. His men were killed or captured. Ragnar was taken prisoner by King Ella of Northumbria. Ella ordered Ragnar to be thrown into a pit of snakes. Ragnar died a long and agonizing death. But he did not ask for mercy. Before he died, he uttered the famous words, "How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers." He was referring to his sons, who would avenge him, and they did avenge him. Ragnar's sons brought the great heathen army to England. They conquered Northumbria, captured King Ella. They executed him with a terrible execution, the Blood Eagle. They cut the skin on the victim's back in the shape of wings, broke the ribs, and pulled out the lungs. Ella died in terrible agony. Vengeance was served. How much truth is in this story? It's hard to say. Frankish chronicles mention a Viking named Reginharus, who did indeed besiege Paris in 845. Anglo-Saxon chronicles speak of the great heathen army that arrived in 865. The leaders of this army are named Ingvar and Ubbe, possibly Ivar and Ubba, Ragnar's sons. But was Reginharus the same person as the Ragnar of the sagas? Were Ivar and Ubba his sons? Maybe. Or maybe the sagas combined several different people into one image, creating an ideal hero, brave, cunning, indomitable, who lived a vibrant life and died a worthy death. For the Vikings, it didn't matter where truth ended and legend began. What mattered was that Ragnar symbolized their ideal, a warrior who feared no one, who challenged kings and gods, who died with a song on his lips, knowing that his children would avenge him. His name became a symbol of the Viking Age. To this day, more than 1,000 years later, TV series are made and books are written about Ragnar Lodbrok. The legend lives on. Now for a man of a completely different sort. not a warrior and a plunderer, but an explorer. Leif Erikson, who discovered America 500 years before Columbus. Leif was born around 970. He was the son of Eric the Red, the founder of the Greenlandic colonies, and the grandson of Thorvald, who was exiled from Norway for murder. The family was noble but restless. His grandfather fled from Norway to Iceland. His father was exiled from Iceland to Greenland. Leif continued the tradition. He went even further west. Around the year 1000, Leif decided to explore the lands that were rumored to exist. An Icelandic merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson had told that about 15 years earlier, while sailing from Iceland to Greenland, he had been blown off course. He saw unknown lands to the west, shores with forests and hills. But he did not land. He hurried to Greenland. Now his story was remembered. Leif bought Bjarni's ship and gathered a crew of 35 men. He set sail west from Greenland. He sailed for several days until he saw land. The first land was rocky, covered with glaciers. Leif named it Helluland, land of flat stones. He landed, looked around, and decided the land was useless. He sailed further south. The second land was forested. Dense forests came right down to the shore. Leif named it Markland, land of forests. Wood was a valuable commodity in Greenland, where trees hardly grew. But Leif wanted to find something better. He sailed on. The third land was beautiful. A mild climate, grass that stayed green even in winter, rivers full of fish. And most surprisingly, something that looked like grapes grew there, or berries from which wine could be made. Leif named the land Vinland, land of wine. The crew built houses and wintered over. They explored the area. They gathered timber and berries. In the spring, they returned to Greenland with a cargo of wood and stories of the new land. Where exactly was Vinland? Archaeologists debated for a long time. In the 1960s, Norwegian archaeologists found the remains of a Scandinavian settlement in Newfoundland on the northern tip of the island at a place called Lance aux Meadows. 8 buildings of a typical Viking type, a smithy where they worked iron, and objects of Scandinavian origin. Radiocarbon dating placed the settlement at around the year 1000. This was Vinland, or a base for exploring Vinland. The Vikings really did reach America, but they did not stay. Leif returned to Greenland, became a respected man, converted to Christianity, and led the family after his father's death. He never went to Vinland again. Others tried. Leif's brother Thorvald went there but was killed in a skirmish with the locals, Skrælings, probably Indians. An Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni tried to establish a permanent colony, taking his wife, children, and livestock. He stayed for several years, and a child was even born, the first European born in America. But conflicts with the locals, a shortage of supplies, and the distance from home forced them to return. Vinland remained in the sagas as a distant land where the Vikings had gone. Europe forgot about this discovery. When Columbus sailed to America in 1492, he did not know that the Vikings had preceded him by 500 years. Leif Erikson did not become a legend like Ragnar. He was a real person who accomplished a real feat. He proved that the Vikings could cross the Atlantic and reach the New World. He was the first known European to set foot on American soil. In the United States, there is even a Leif Erikson Day, celebrated on October 9th, in honor of the discoverer. Now for a man who changed Scandinavia itself, Harald Fairhair, the unifier of Norway. Before Harald, Norway did not exist as a unified state. There were dozens of petty kingdoms. Each valley, each fjord had its own konung. They fought, made alliances, but no one could unite them all under his rule. Harald was born around 850. He was the son of a minor konung in Vestfold in southern Norway. According to legend, the young Harold fell in love with the beautiful Gyda, the daughter of a konung from Hordaland. He sent matchmakers. Gyda replied proudly, she would not marry a petty konung. Let him first become king of all Norway, just as Gorm became king of Denmark or Eric became king of Sweden. Harold was not offended. He made a vow not to cut or comb his hair until he became king of all Norway. He began his conquests. It took years. Harold was a skilled military commander and a cunning politician. He defeated some konungs in battle, made alliances with others, and married the daughters of a third group. Gradually, his kingdom grew. The decisive battle took place around 872 at Hafrsfjord, a huge naval battle where Harold's fleet fought against the combined fleet of his opponents. The battle lasted a long time, and losses were huge on both sides, but Harold won. After that, the resistance was broken. The konungs submitted one after another. Those who did not want to submit fled. Many sailed to Iceland, the Orkney Islands, and Ireland. They preferred exile to submission. Harold became king of Norway. He cut his hair, which he had not cut for 10 years. It was long and beautiful, and from then on he was nicknamed Harold Fairhair. But ruling a united country proved more difficult than conquering it. Harold introduced new laws, new taxes. He took lands from the disobedient and gave them to his men. Many considered him a tyrant who had taken away their ancient freedoms. This led to a wave of emigration. It was during Harold's reign that the mass settlement of Iceland began. Harold had many wives and even more children. The exact number is unknown. The sagas name up to 20 sons. After his death, around 930, they began to divide the inheritance and fight with each other. The unification almost fell apart. But in the end, one of the sons, Eric Bloodaxe, prevailed, and he was later replaced by another son, Håkon the Good. Norway remained united, though not without a struggle. Harold laid the foundation, created the idea of a united Norway. This was his legacy. Was Harold a hero or a tyrant? It depends on your point of view. For those who wanted unification, a strong state, he was a great king. For those who valued the old freedoms, the independence of the petty konungs, he was an oppressor. History remembers him as the unifier, the founder of the Norwegian state. But the price of unification was high. And finally, Knut the Great, a man who created an empire for a brief moment when it seemed that the entire North would unite under one crown. Knut was born around 995. He was the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, the Danish king who conquered England in 1013. But Sweyn died a few weeks after his victory. The English expelled the Danes and restored their own king. The young Knut decided to reclaim what had been conquered. In 1015, he led a huge army to England. The Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred died, leaving the kingdom to his son Edmund Ironside. Edmund was a brave warrior and fought fiercely, but Knut was smarter, more cunning. The war went on with mixed success. In the end, they made a treaty. They divided England. Edmund got the south, Knut got the north. But a few months later, Edmund died under mysterious circumstances. Knut became king of all England. He was about 20 years old, ruling a foreign country where he was hated as an invader. But Knut proved to be a wise ruler. He did not act like a conqueror. He took Christianity seriously, patronized the church, built monasteries. He married Ethelred's widow, the Anglo-Saxon Princess Emma, linking himself to the local nobility. He left the Anglo-Saxon jarls, who submitted to him in their positions. He ruled justly according to English laws. The English gradually accepted him. He was better than civil war and chaos. Under him, there was stability, peace, and prosperity. He protected the country from other Vikings, paid his own army, and did not ruin the country with excessive taxes. In 1018, Knut's brother, who ruled Denmark, died. Knut became king of Denmark. Now he ruled two countries, England and Denmark. In 1028, he conquered Norway, expelling the local king, Olaf the Holy. Knut became king of Norway. Knut's empire covered all of northern Europe, England, Denmark, Norway, parts of Sweden, and had influence in Scotland. He was called the Lord of the North Sea. It seemed that the Scandinavian world had united under one crown. Knut was at the height of his power. He traveled to Rome, met with the Pope, and was present at the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor. He was respected by all European rulers. He was a Christian king, a protector of the Church, a generous benefactor. A famous legend is associated with Knut. It is said that his courtiers flattered him, calling him the greatest, the almighty. Knut grew tired of the flattery. He ordered his throne to be placed on the seashore during high tide. He sat on the throne and commanded the sea to stop, not to rise any higher. The sea, of course, did not obey. The waves rolled in and wet the king's feet. Knut stood up and said to his courtiers, "Do you see? Even a king cannot command nature. The power of man is insignificant before the power of God. Do not flatter me, I am as mortal as everyone else. Whether this is true or a legend is unknown. But the story shows Knut as a wise ruler who understood the limits of his power. But his empire was fragile. It was held together by the strength of Knut's personality, his authority, his ability to balance different interests. After his death in 1035, everything fell apart almost instantly. Knut had two sons from different wives. They divided the inheritance and began to quarrel. The son of the English wife ruled in England, the son of the Danish concubine in Denmark and Norway. A few years later, both died young, without heirs. England returned to the Anglo-Saxon dynasty. Norway gained independence. Denmark remained Danish. Knut's empire ceased to exist, but for a brief moment, 2 decades, it was a reality. Knut showed that the unification of the North was possible, that peaceful coexistence of Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons was possible, that the creation of a large state was possible. Although his empire did not outlive him, the idea remained. The ties between England and Scandinavia established under Knut continued. 30 years later, the Normans from Normandy would conquer England again, and again the North and South would be connected. 4 men, 4 destinies. Ragnar, a legend, a symbol of the era, the embodiment of the Viking spirit. Leif, an explorer who discovered a new world. Harold, a state builder who united a fragmented country. Snut, an emperor who created a great but short-lived empire. They were different, but they were all Vikings. They all lived life to the fullest, were not afraid to take risks, and dreamed big. They all left a mark on history, and their names live on 1,000 years later. The Viking Age was an age of individuals, when one person could change history, could found a kingdom, discover a continent, create a legend, when there were no faceless masses, but specific people with names, characters, and destinies. And we remember them. We remember Ragnar, dying in the pit of snakes. Leif, stepping onto the shore of the new world. Harold, vowing not to cut his hair. Knut, sitting before the advancing sea. Their time has passed, but their stories remain. And as long as we tell these stories, as long as we remember their names, they are alive. Just as the Vikings themselves believed, fame outlives death, a name outlives the body. They achieved their goal. They are immortal in our memory. Everything comes to an end eventually, even the greatest eras. Even the Viking Age, which lasted for 3 centuries, came to an end. Not suddenly, not in a single day. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the world changed, and the Vikings changed with it. By the mid-11th century, the Scandinavians were no longer the same as they were at the end of the 8th. They were still warriors, still built ships, still traveled, but something inside was changing. The spirit of the times was different. Let's try to understand what happened, why the Viking Age ended. One of the main reasons was Christianity. The new faith came from the south, slowly but steadily penetrating Scandinavian society. And it changed everything: the worldview, the values, the very essence of what it meant to be a Viking. Christian missionaries began to come to Scandinavia as early as the 8th and 9th centuries. They were brave men, these missionaries. To go to the pagans, who could kill you or sacrifice you to their gods, required enormous courage. The first attempts often ended in failure. Ansgar, a Frankish monk, came to Denmark and Sweden in the 830s. He was allowed to preach, even to build a church in Birka. Some were baptized, but most remained faithful to Odin and Thor. After Ansgar's departure, Christianity in Sweden almost disappeared. The problem was that Christianity required the rejection of the old gods, of the old way of life. It preached humility, forgiveness of enemies, and condemned violence. For a Viking raised in a culture of strength, honor, and revenge, this was alien. Odin was the god of warriors, wise men, and kings. Thor protected people from giants and chaos. Freya bestowed love and fertility. These gods were understandable, close. They were part of the Vikings' world. The Christian God was distant, incomprehensible. He demanded submission, obedience, and the rejection of the old ways. But gradually, Christianity made inroads. First, through merchants. A merchant who traded with Christian countries often accepted baptism for convenience. In Christian lands, it was more difficult for an unbaptized person to do business, to make treaties. Prima signatio, this was the name for this superficial baptism, when a person formally accepted the faith, but did not change his life. Then, through wives. Scandinavian chieftains married Christian princesses for political alliances. The wives brought priests with them, built churches, and baptized their children. The children grew up in the Christian faith. Then, through force. Christian kings understood that the new faith strengthened their power. The church taught obedience to the king as God's anointed. The church was literate, could keep records, and help govern the state. Christianity connected the Scandinavian kingdoms with the rest of Europe, making them part of the Christian world. Denmark was the first to adopt Christianity. King Harald Bluetooth was baptized around 960. The huge runestone at Jelling, which he erected, proclaims, "King Haraldr ordered this monument made in memory of Gormr, his father, and in memory of Tyrve, his mother, that Haraldr, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian." Of course, one royal decree could not change the faith of the people overnight. Many continued to worship the old gods in secret. There were uprisings against the new faith. But gradually, over several generations, Denmark became Christian. Norway was Christianized later and with greater resistance. King Olaf Tryggvason forcibly Christianized the country at the end of the 10th century. He destroyed pagan sanctuaries, killed or exiled those who refused to be baptized. He was a fanatic, and his methods aroused hatred. In the year 1000, he died in a sea battle, and paganism returned to many places. But the next king, Olaf, later called Olaf the Holy, continued the Christianization in 1015 through 1028. He was harsher than his predecessor. According to the sagas, he tortured, maimed, and killed stubborn pagans. He wanted to eradicate the old faith completely. Many Norwegians rebelled. They called upon the Danish king Knut the Great, and Olaf was exiled. He fled to Rus, to Prince Yaroslav the Wise. 2 years later, he tried to return, but was killed at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. After his death, Olaf became a saint. Stories were told of miracles at his grave, of healings. The church canonized him. Saint Olaf became the patron saint of Norway. The irony is that the man whom many Norwegians hated in life became their main saint. But this often happens in history. By the mid-11th century, Norway was formally Christian, but in remote areas, in the mountains and forests, the old faith held on for a long time. It mixed with Christianity, creating strange hybrids, the veneration of saints mixed with sacrifices to elves, prayers in church, and spells at sacred stones. Sweden was the last to be Christianized. There, Christianity and paganism coexisted throughout the 11th century. At Uppsala, the main pagan sanctuary, sacrifices to the gods, continued until the end of the 11th century, when the sanctuary was destroyed and a church was built in its place. Iceland adopted Christianity in a special way. In the year 1000, a dispute broke out at the Althing, to remain pagans or to be baptized. The country was divided, threatening civil war. The law speaker Thorgir, himself a pagan, took it upon himself to make the decision. He went under his cloak for a day and thought. Then he came out and announced, Iceland would be Christian to preserve unity and peace. But old customs, eating horse meat, leaving infants to die if the family could not feed them, secretly worshipping the old gods, would not be punished. The decision was accepted. Iceland was Christianized peacefully, without bloodshed. Gradually, the pagan allowances disappeared, but the fact of a peaceful transition was unique. Christianity changed Scandinavian society profoundly. The church condemned raids, robbery, and violence. It preached peace and denounced blood feuds. It demanded obedience to kings who ruled by God's will. All of this undermined the foundations of the Viking way of life. A warrior who believed in Valhalla did not fear death in battle. Moreover, he desired it. A Christian feared sin, feared hell. Killing became a sin, even in battle. Revenge became a sin. Plundering churches, a sacrilege that brought a curse. Gradually, the Vikings became Christian knights. They still fought, but now in the name of Christ, for a holy cause. They still sought fame, but now a righteous fame, approved by the Church. The Crusades of the 12th and 13th centuries attracted many Scandinavians, the same campaigns, but sanctified by religion. There were other reasons for the decline. Europe became stronger. In the 8th and 9th centuries, it was weak, fragmented, and unprepared to fight back. By the 11th century, the European kingdoms had grown stronger. Castles were built, standing armies were created, and cities were fortified. The French king no longer paid Danegeld. He had a strong army, loyal vassals, and castles throughout the country. A Viking sailing up the Seine now met fortified cities, ready troops, not defenseless monasteries. The English kings also grew stronger. Alfred the Great and his descendants built a system of burhs, fortified towns where the population could take refuge from raids. They created a fleet that could meet the Vikings at sea. By the 11th century, raiding England had become more difficult and dangerous. The Scandinavians themselves were changing. They were becoming sedentary. Why risk one's life on a distant raid when one could live at home, plow the land, trade, and raise children? Trade provided wealth more safely than plunder. One could get rich as a merchant without becoming a warrior. The Scandinavian kingdoms were strengthening, becoming centralized states. The king no longer tolerated independent jarls who gathered retinues and sailed off to plunder. He demanded submission, payment of taxes, and service in the royal army. A Viking, who was once free to go wherever he wanted, was now a subject of the king. The climate also played a role. The medieval climatic optimum, the warm period from the 8th to the 11th centuries, was coming to an end. It was getting colder. Harvests were failing. Life was becoming harder. The Greenlandic colonies began to experience problems. The summer became shorter, hay did not have time to dry, and livestock starved in winter. By the 15th century, the colonies had disappeared, possibly due to the cooling climate. All of this came together. Christianity undermined the ideology. Europe was becoming stronger. Scandinavia was becoming sedentary. The climate was worsening. The Viking Age was drawing to a close, and a symbol of this decline was one event: the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th, 1066. In that year, the English king Edward the Confessor died without an heir. Several people laid claim to the throne. Harold Godwinson, a powerful English jarl, was elected king by the Anglo-Saxon nobility. But there were other claimants. One of them was Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway. Harold the Hard Ruler, as his nickname translates. He was the last great Viking, a warrior of the old school. Harold lived an incredible life. At 15, he participated in the Battle of Stiklestad, where his brother Olaf the Holy died. Wounded, he fled to Rus. He served Prince Yaroslav, fell in love with his daughter Elizabeth. Then he went to Constantinople, served in the Varangian Guard, fought all over the Mediterranean. He became famous for his bravery and cruelty, and grew rich. He returned to Russes, married Elizabeth, then returned to Norway and became king. By 1066, he was over 50, a great age for those times. But he was still a warrior, still thirsty for fame. He believed he had a claim to the English throne through complex dynastic ties. He decided to conquer England. In September of 1066, Harold sailed to England with a huge fleet, 300 ships, perhaps 10,000 warriors. It was the last great Viking army that attempted to conquer England. They landed in the northeast, defeated the local militia, and captured York. It seemed like a successful start. Harold set up camp at Stamford Bridge, a small river near York. He was waiting for negotiations, hostages, and submission. But the English King Harold acted quickly. He had gathered an army in the south, expecting an invasion from Normandy. But when he learned of the Norwegian landing, he made a swift forced march to the north. In 4 days, he covered 300 kilometers. The Norwegians did not even know he was close. On September 25th, the English army suddenly appeared at Stamford Bridge. The Norwegians were unprepared. Part of the army was on the other side of the river. Many had left their armor in the camp. The day was hot. Harold was in light clothing, but they were Vikings. They did not flee. They began to form up for battle. According to legend, one Viking with a battle axe stood on the bridge over the river and single-handedly fought off the entire English army until someone rowed a boat under the bridge and pierced him with a spear from below. The battle was fierce. The Norwegians fought desperately, but the English had the advantage of numbers and freshness. Harold Hardrada was killed by an arrow to the throat. His standard-bearer fell beside him. The Norwegians faltered but did not flee. They continued to fight until dark. By evening, the Norwegian army was annihilated. Of the 300 ships that had sailed to England, 24 returned. The rest were not needed. There was no one left to sail them. Harold's son, Olaf, who survived the battle, took the remnants of the army home. Harold Hardrada was the last great Viking. His death on the battlefield in England symbolized the end of the era. Never again did the Scandinavians attempt to conquer England. Never again did they assemble such huge fleets for campaigns to the south. The irony is that 3 days after the victory at Stamford Bridge, King Harold learned that another claimant had landed in the south, William, Duke of Normandy. Harold made another forced march to the south, met William at the Battle of Hastings on October 14th, and lost. He was killed, according to legend, by an arrow to the eye. William conquered England. he became king. But William was not a Viking. He was a Norman, a descendant of Vikings, but he spoke French, was a Christian, a feudal lord, a knight. He brought to England not drachars and battle axes, but castles and knightly cavalry, the French language and continental customs. The year 1066 was a turning point. In it, the Viking Age died. The last attempt at conquest in the old style failed at Stamford Bridge. The new style, the Norman style, won at Hastings. The world had changed. After 1066, the Scandinavians did not disappear, of course. They continued to live, to fight, to travel. But they were different. They were Christian kingdoms, part of medieval Europe. Their kings intermarried with European dynasties. Their churches were subordinate to the Pope. Their society was becoming feudal. They participated in the Crusades. The Norwegians and Danes conducted crusades against the pagan tribes of the Baltic. The Swedes forcibly Christianized the Finns. These were still campaigns, still conquests, but now in the name of Christ, under the banner of the cross. They created medieval kingdoms. Denmark became a strong power, rivaling Germany. Norway controlled vast territories, including Iceland, Greenland, and the islands around Scotland. Sweden expanded to the east, into Finland and the Baltics. They maintained ties with the world created by the Vikings. The Icelanders recorded the sagas, stories of the Vikings, of the old times. These sagas preserved the memory of the era, of the heroes, of the adventures. Thanks to the sagas, we know about Ragnar, Leif, about the campaigns and discoveries. But the spirit had changed. A Viking was a free warrior, an adventurer, a man who acknowledged no authority over him except the gods and fate. A medieval Scandinavian knight was a vassal of the king, a servant of the church, a man integrated into the hierarchy of feudal society. A Viking believed in Valhalla, in the glory of deeds, in the idea that one's name would outlive death. A Christian Scandinavian believed in heaven, in the salvation of the soul, in the need to live righteously to get to heaven. A Viking sailed in a drachar, fast and flexible, attacked suddenly, and disappeared before the enemy could gather. A medieval warrior built castles, besieged cities, fought in heavy armor in the ranks of knightly cavalry. The world had changed. The Viking Age was over. A new era had begun, the era of medieval kingdoms, crusades, feudalism. The Scandinavians became part of this new world, dissolved into it, but the memory remained. It remained in the sagas, in place, names, in languages, in genes. It remained in Iceland, where the descendants of the first settlers still live, speaking a language close to Old Norse. It remained in England, in Ireland, in France, in Rus, wherever the Vikings had gone. And it remained in the imagination. The image of the Viking, a bearded warrior with an axe, a fearless seafarer, an explorer of unknown lands, lives on to this day. 1,000 years after the end of the era, we still admire the Vikings, tell stories about them, make films, and write books. Perhaps because they embodied something eternal, a thirst for freedom, a striving for adventure, a desire to leave a mark, to live a vibrant life. Perhaps because in our ordered, safe world, we long for a time when one could board a ship and sail beyond the horizon towards the unknown. The Viking Age is over, but the Vikings are not dead. They live in us, in our memory, in our dreams of freedom and adventure. And as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their stories, they are immortal. Just as they wanted, just as the old songs said, fame outlives death. The Vikings achieved their fame, and their fame will live forever. The era has passed. Drachars no longer roam the seas in search of plunder. The last warriors of the old school have long since turned to dust. The temples of Odin and Thor are destroyed. Christian churches stand in their place. But the legacy of the Vikings is alive. It surrounds us, even if we don't always notice it. Let's look at what remains from that turbulent era. What the Vikings left to the world besides fear and destruction, because, as it turns out, they left a great deal. Let's start with the most amazing, a real treasure, with the Scandinavian sagas. Imagine Iceland in the 13th century, a small island at the edge of the world where the descendants of the Vikings live. Christianity has long since triumphed. Monasteries stand all over the island. Priests read Latin prayers. But the memory of the old times is alive. Old men still tell the stories they heard from their grandfathers, and they from theirs. And then people come along who decide to write these stories down, on parchment, with ink, in Latin letters, but in their native Icelandic language. They write everything down, stories of kings and heroes, of campaigns and battles, of love and revenge, of gods and giants. Thus, the sagas are born. The word saga comes from the Icelandic segja, to say, to tell. Sagas are told stories, turned into written ones. They are incredibly diverse. There are sagas of kings, long chronicles of Scandinavian rulers. Heimskringla, by Snorri Sturluson, written in the early 13th century, tells the history of the Norwegian kings from legendary times to the 12th century. There are semi-divine ancestors and real historical figures. There are Harald Fairhair, Olaf the Holy, Harald Hardrada. Each has his own story. There are sagas of Icelanders, stories of specific families and people who lived in Iceland in the 10th and 11th centuries. Njal's saga tells of the wise law speaker Njal and his friend Gunnar, of their feud with other families that led to tragedy. Egil's saga is about the poet and warrior Egil Skallagrimsson, a complex, contradictory man. Grettis' saga is about the mighty outlaw hero who performed great deeds but was cursed with bad luck. There are sagas of ancient times, legendary stories of heroes of the past. Völsunga saga tells of Sigurd the dragon slayer, of the cursed gold, of love and betrayal. These sagas mix reality with myth, history with fantasy. They are like a bridge between the pagan past and the Christian present. The sagas are written in an amazing style, dry, laconic, almost without emotion. They don't describe feelings, don't give evaluations. They simply tell what happened. Then Gunnar took his sword and struck the enemy. He fell down dead. That's it. No extra words, no drama. But behind this dryness lies incredible power. The sagas are full of dialogue. People speak in short, pithy phrases, often with bitter irony. A warrior, dying from a wound, says, "Broad red shirts have become fashionable," meaning the blood on his clothes. Before his execution, a man asks, "Don't hold me. I want to see if it's true what they say, that a severed head can still see for a moment." And after the execution, his companion asks, "Well, is it true?" This style, Scandinavian restraint, the ability to joke in the face of death, pervades all the sagas. It was the Viking ideal, to face everything, even death, with composure and irony. The sagas have preserved an incredible amount of information about how the Vikings lived, how they dressed, what they ate, how they settled disputes, about their laws, customs, and beliefs, about their ships and weapons, their travels and trade. Without the sagas, we would know much less about the Vikings. But the sagas are not just historical documents. They are literature, art. Some of them are masterpieces of world literature. Njal's saga, with its complex structure, numerous characters, and tragic plot, can rival Greek tragedies. Egil's saga, is a psychologically profound portrait of a complex personality, a poet-warrior torn between a thirst for fame and love for his family. The sagas have influenced world culture. Through them, the romantics of the 19th century rediscovered the Vikings. Wagner created his Ring of the Nibelung, based on Scandinavian legends. Tolkien drew inspiration from the sagas when creating The Lord of the Rings. The names of his dwarves are taken from the poetic Edda, and the dragons and underground treasures came from the sagas of ancient times. Modern films, series, and books about the Vikings, they all rely on the sagas in one way or another. Without the sagas, the Vikings would be faceless robbers to us, mentioned only in medieval chronicles. Thanks to the sagas, they have become living people with names, characters, and stories. Now for another legacy, a material, technical one. The Viking ships. The Drakkar was a marvel of its time. Fast, light, strong, capable of crossing the ocean and sailing up a shallow river. The world had seen nothing like it before, nor for a long time after the Vikings. The technology of building Drakkars was perfect. The hull was made of long planks, laid overlapping. This technique is called clinker-built. The planks were fastened to each other with iron rivets. The keel was carved from a single mighty oak. The ribs, the ship's frames, were tied to the planking with straps or ropes made from spruce roots. This gave the ship flexibility. It bent with the waves, but did not break. Modern scientists who have studied the construction were amazed at how the Vikings intuitively found the optimal solutions that science only reached in the 20th century. The sail was sewn from wool impregnated with fat or tar for water resistance. It was rectangular, attached to a single mast. A simple design, but effective. The Drakkar could sail with a following or side wind, reaching speeds of up to 12 to 15 knots. For a wooden ship of the 9th century, this was incredible. When there was no wind, or it was a headwind, they rowed. The oars were long and heavy. Rowing for hours was hard work. But the Drakkar could go under oars where no sailing ship could. The draft of the Drakkar was shallow, about 1 meter. It could enter river mouths, navigate in shallow waters where large ships would run aground. It could be pulled ashore, portaged overland from river to river. This gave the Vikings incredible mobility. The beauty of the Drakkar was in its simplicity. No complex mechanisms, no redundancy. Every detail served its function. The bow and stern were raised high so that waves would not swamp the deck. The sides were low to make rowing easier. The keel was deep so that the ship would sail straight under sail. And the decorations. A carved head of a dragon or a snake on the bow, from which the name Drakkar, dragon ship, originated. Colored shields hung along the sides. A striped or painted sail. A weather vane on the mast in the shape of Odin's raven or another symbol. The Drakkar was not just a means of transport, it was a work of art, an embodiment of the owner's pride. Archaeologists have found several well-preserved Viking ships. The Gokstad ship from Norway, found in a burial mound, is a military Drakkar, 23 meters long. The Oseberg ship is slightly smaller, richly decorated with carvings, and probably belonged to a noblewoman. The Skuldelev ships from Denmark are 5 different ships sunk in a fjord as a barrier. From these finds, scientists have reconstructed the technology. They have built replicas, launched them, and sailed them. It turned out that the ancient ships work perfectly. A replica of the Gokstad ship crossed the Atlantic at the end of the 19th century, sailing from Norway to America. It proved that the Vikings really could make such voyages. The shipbuilding technology of the Vikings influenced all subsequent development of maritime affairs in northern Europe. The Hanseatic cogs of the Middle Ages, the Dutch fluits of the early modern period, they are all heirs to the Drakkars. Clinker building was used in Scandinavia until the 20th century. The principles discovered by the Vikings proved to be timeless. But the influence of the Vikings is not limited to sagas and ships. They influenced the very fabric of European civilization: culture, languages, genetics. Let's start with languages. The Vikings left thousands of words in European languages, especially in English. In the Danelaw, the region of England ruled by the Danes, the Scandinavian language mixed with Anglo-Saxon. An Anglo-Scandinavian dialect emerged. Many words from it entered the English language. Basic words like sky, egg, cake, knife came from Scandinavian languages. The pronouns they, them, their are also of Scandinavian origin, replacing the native English ones. Many words starting with ske, skin, ski, skirt, skull are Scandinavian. Even the grammar of the English language was simplified under the influence of Scandinavian. When two peoples lived together and tried to understand each other, the language became simpler, lost complex endings, and became more analytical. Some linguists believe that it was the Scandinavian influence that made English so grammatically simple compared to other Germanic languages. Place names in England are also often Scandinavian. The endings by, village, thorpe, hamlet, toft, homestead, thwaite, clearing, all are Scandinavian. Thousands of place names in northern and eastern England have Scandinavian origins. There are fewer Scandinavian words in the French language, but they exist. Words related to the sea, hewn, mast, singler, to sail, vague, wave, may have come from the Normans. The word Normandy itself, Normandy, means land of the Northmen. In the Russian language, Varangian influence is also noticeable. Many names of the first generations of Russian princes are Scandinavian. Oleg, from Helgi; Olga, the female form of Helgi; Igor, from Ingvar. Words like Yabeda, slanderer, from embeti, office; Knut, whip, from the Scandinavian Knuter; Variag, Varangian, all are traces of the Varangian presence. Geographical names have also been preserved. Ladoga, possibly from a Finnish name, but entered history through the Varangians. Novgorod, possibly a calque of the Scandinavian Holmgard. Rurikovo Gorodishche, the site of Rurik's first residence. The cultural influence is even broader. The democratic traditions of Scandinavia, things, all things, assemblies of free people, influenced the development of parliamentarism. The Icelandic Althing, founded in 930, is considered one of the oldest parliaments in the world. The tradition of popular assemblies was preserved in Scandinavia and evolved into modern democratic institutions. Legal traditions also bear the mark of the Vikings. In England, the Danelaw long operated in the areas of Scandinavian settlement. It differed from Anglo-Saxon law and had its own features. Some legal principles from it entered into English common law. In Rus, the Varangian princes brought the experience of state-building. The retinue system, the relationship between a prince and his retainers based on personal loyalty and mutual obligations, all of this has parallels with Scandinavian traditions. The Russian principality was formed under the influence of both Slavic and Varangian traditions. The genetic legacy of the Vikings is also real. Modern DNA studies show traces of Scandinavian genes throughout Europe.